After how much fun I had making my game ranking last year, I spent the whole year subconsciously looking forward to working on this. When I was looking back at the games I played at the end of last year, I tried to make an effort to play an even bigger variety, and that's how I ended up with 70 games on this list. That can also be accredited to trying more short games, not wasting as much time on a game if I'm not enjoying it, but also personal circumstances. Luckily, I've gotten better at working out what I like and won't like, so while I did find some enjoyment with almost every entry, I still got plenty of opinions. I could spend ages explaining myself, but let's get on to the games I played in 2023. While there are games on this list which I think are objectively worse than Rune Factory 5, it was my worst gaming experience of the year for how much time I put in and how little it felt like I was getting out of it. I'd put almost 20 hours into Rune Factory 5 before I eventually decided to give up, and in that time it felt like I'd barely made a change in a game which apparently I was halfway through the story of. Part of this might have been oversights on my behalf, but every few hours I would look up at Vice forums, tip videos, and I really wasn't doing anything that wrong. But everything just felt so incohesive, and I kept thinking that the gameplay would get more interesting, whether it was the life sim, the farming, the combat, the dungeon exploration, the dating sim, but it all felt randomly distributed and lacked any real depth. The life sim elements were fine but weren't particularly rewarding, the farming felt bare bones, and the combat was using the most basic action RPG mechanics at their worst. The dungeons were sporadic and essentially just cycled through the Rolodex of RPG dungeon elements, the nature one, the volcano one, the ice one, etc. And while the dating sim was apparently there based on the relationship menu I could access at any time, none of the characters ever had any personal development and very few unique interactions, in spite of how many of their favourite foods I would throw at them. And also, whenever this game is discussed, it really does feel like the elephant in the room, but it looks really bad. Sure, some Switch games look subpar, especially if they're ports, but this game was a Switch exclusive at launch in 2021. Like, sure, if it was a massive open world game, then yeah, some areas might look janky, but how does the average size hub town look like assets thrown in a blender made in 2006? And honestly, that's a disservice to games from 2006. In spite of all of this, I didn't actually hate Rune Factory 5. I'm sure some people put more time into it and ended up with a more satisfying experience, and I could occasionally see moments of charm slip through with some dialogue and details. But when I'm on my deathbed, I think I'm going to want the 18 hours I spent on it back. Neither God of Rock nor Rune Factory 5 are great games, far from it, but even though Rune Factory 5 is probably better objectively, I appreciate what God of Rock was going for, even though it didn't really succeed with any of it. I picked it up spontaneously on sale, then got a bit of buyer's remorse after glancing over average review scores, but then regained a bit of hope when seeing it was nominated for Best Fighting Game at the Game Awards. But upon actually playing it, my negative expectations for the game were unfortunately fulfilled. If you haven't heard of it before, God of Rock is a rhythm fighting hybrid where the better you do at the rhythm game, the better you're doing in the fight, and you can do certain moves to obstruct your opponent. But this combination just never falls into place. The connection between your fighting and skill at the rhythm game just never seems to connect unless you're doing awfully, and the rhythm gameplay feels unresponsive, which is kind of a death knell in this genre. The main gameplay mode, like most fighting games, is an arcade mode, but it's scaled really poorly, since even on lower difficulties, at the end of the arcade mode you'll be facing extreme difficulty tracks, which when you're trying a normal difficulty arcade setting feels almost impossible, especially when the CPU is nailing it, making the difficulty exponentially harder. Even worse considering the music used in the game is pretty generic video game background music, which would be fine for a standard game, but not for a rhythm game. I honestly was attracted to it since I enjoy most rhythm games, but also the character designs looked interesting and I like the style, even if some of them look like Dislike knockoffs. But it kind of sucks that the background you get for them is minimal, and you can barely appreciate them when playing because you have to stare at the rhythm track the whole time. I desperately wanted to like God of Rock since it has a relatively strong concept and style, but the core gameplay was badly executed, making it feel like I was playtesting, not playing a final product, which is apparently a contender for Best Fighting Game of the Year. I hope the team who worked on it can maybe make some drastic changes with a sequel or a new start, since there is something here which could work. Compared to the last two entries, this game is a lot more competent, but it's so low because of how disappointing it was. I played the original Pokken tournament when it launched on the Wii U and remembered enjoying it, but since it had been so long since then, I thought it'd be a good time to revisit the Switch port, which added characters and supports. Upon my return to a game I remembered liking, I realised three things. Firstly, the gameplay, while flashy, lacked much substance. Secondly, the new characters were fine, but didn't actually add much to the game. And lastly, the story mode had been left unchanged and unimproved. The single player progression essentially includes battles upon battles and then stakeless tournaments to work up ranks that just require more and more battles, with occasional intermissions of the narrator talking about a Dark Mewtwo. The sheer quantity of meaningless repetitive fights in the same boring settings but with some Pokemon in the background quickly grew grating. Also, the game actually discouraged trying different fighters out, with a single player defaulting to using your partner Pokemon. So if you want to change, you have to exit all the way out of the story mode, into the trainer settings, then back out and load up the story mode again, and you can only do this at certain intervals. Of course, in a fighting game you can expect to do lots of fights, but the way this was structured made it feel unfathomably grindy for very little reward, and after I'd made my way for about 3/4 of the story, I saw how many battles needed to be done to finish it, considered how little I cared about the story, and left it. I wish I just left this game as a fond memory of the Wii U era instead of going back to revisit it, but at least now I won't want to come back for a third attempt. I'd heard great things from a friend who loved this remake of a childhood favourite, and since licensed games usually don't get much attention for long after they release, this one getting a remake so late on must be an indicator of how good it is, right? Battle for Bikini Bottom was fun for a little while, but as I was worried of going in, the signs of its age couldn't really be covered up with modern graphics which if anything maybe detract from the charm of the original, turning beloved cartoon characters into dead-eyed, stiff-moving caricatures. 3D platformers with open-ended designs letting you dot between different areas in whatever order can be fun, but the lack of any sense of progression makes them hard to get through, especially if they aren't short. Exploring these worlds can be fun, but the charm tends to wear thin, even more so if you aren't the target audience, and I think mindlessly exploring these sandboxes is a lot more fun when your age is in the single digits, or if you're a massive fan of the sponge. And while I enjoy the show, I didn't really grow up with it enough to motivate me to work through this game. What does interest me though is that after the success of this game, it got a sequel, and with that being a wholly modern project, it could have the better structure, pacing, and look that might interest me to actually reach the credits instead of quitting halfway like I did with this one. I played SpongeBob because it was free with PS Plus, and like that, the Happy Home Paradise of New Horizons was free with a Nintendo Online expansion pass, and since I didn't want to renew it again, I thought I might as well try it. While it disguises itself as a game and even structures itself similarly, Happy Home Paradise is a 10-hour-long sequence that you need to complete to get more decoration options for the base game. It has charming presentation with some sweet new characters and occasional distractions like designing other buildings like shops, a hospital or a school, but at its core you'll be decorating around 30 houses, get a cute DJ KK cameo, and then credits. It's a fun distraction, and if I was more actively playing the base game, I think I would have enjoyed it more, but when I stopped playing New Horizons, I came away from it pretty jaded. I love New Leaf, but New Horizons was clearly moving away from the life sim elements I enjoyed, and towards the tailor-made town decorator I wasn't as interested in, and Happy Home Paradise is just an extension of that. Having more decoration options is great, especially if you love that aspect of Animal Crossing, but I can't help but be skeptical and assume the context for unlocking these features is just a justification for Nintendo to be able to ask half the cost of the original game for this expansion pass, which is why I am happy I didn't directly pay for it, but for those who did and don't care about decorating too much, I express my condolences. Bloodroots is one of those games I picked up on sale and had fun with for a little while, but like a lot of repetitive try and try again arcade style games, the charm wore off pretty fast. The level structure at least made it easy to pick up and play, but I find that games with this structure are just as easy to put down. The simple concept of grabbing weapons with limited uses to get past enemies that will instantly kill you was occasionally fun, and with the level layout the pacing was kept relatively tight, but that was held back by the need for repetition on harder, longer levels without many or any checkpoints. And by the time I reached the first major boss, it was a longer level with fewer checkpoints and a massive difficulty spike. I realized that I could be playing something else, and I haven't looked back, except to write this I guess. Difficult repetitive games can be fun, I know because I enjoy other ones, but if the core gameplay isn't engaging enough, going for another attempt quickly stops being appealing. I bought Pathless a little while ago and had it sitting on my shelf waiting for when I wanted a fun, short game with a fresh concept. So when I finally thought it was time to play, I was disappointed that the progression system killed the pacing and the core concept of long distance traversal sped up by hitting targets was nowhere near as satisfying as it looked, and I soured on it a lot quicker than I would have hoped. The main issue is that the game requires you to scour the areas it presents to you, squeeze out almost all of the content before you're allowed to progress onto the next section of the story, and when the areas are so lacking in much interesting going on and the puzzles you're searching for are mostly unintuitive and rarely engaging, my willpower drained quickly. It would have been easier if speeding around the environments was as rewarding as it looks in footage, but in practice the momentary speed boosts just make everything else feel slower. What sucks about this is with some minor tweaking, maybe requiring fewer points to progress, or some improvement to the traversal, this would have felt a lot more rewarding to play. But as it is, I couldn't force myself past a certain point. Sticking to the standard worst to best ranking order sometimes leads to weird situations where if I like a sequel less than the original in the same year, I'll have to talk about it first, and that's what's going to happen with the second game in the Atelier Ryza trilogy. Not to spoil how much higher the first Atelier Ryza game is, but when the original succeeds so well at what it does, it feels a little nonsensical that the follow-up need to reinvent the wheel so aggressively. While elements are retained, both the combat and the alchemy were changed pretty drastically, and since in my opinion, both are done worse than they were in the original, it's hard not to compare it to something I had previously thought they'd already got perfect. One of the main things I enjoyed about the original was the characters, and the character-focused narrative, and this was kept in the sequel, but a whole new range of characters are added to the party, and because I care about the original cast, there being such a strong focus on the less interesting new ones, I found it harder to enjoy. Because I still enjoyed that core cast, I'm probably going to come back to this so I can continue and finish the trilogy. It's a shame, but when a game is a direct sequel, it's hard not to compare it to what came before it, and while some changes are positive, like quality of life adjustments, if almost everything else is worse, it'll be hard not to miss what once was. Bully, or Canis Canem Edit if you're following government regulations, is a game with a lot of personality, and that's what drew me to it. But playing through half of the campaign made me realize that I don't think that I love the story structure of Rockstar games, and since this one feels noticeably dated, the issues are magnified. The idea of a Rockstar game set in a private school works well, but it just felt a bit janky in execution. I think at the time of release it would have been quite impressive, and if I had some more time to just mess around in the open world and discover all the secrets, then I might have been more immersed. But playing it in 2023 without any modern quality of life improvements and a story which just didn't grab me, I couldn't really be too bothered to keep going. It's the kind of game I can see myself enjoying under different circumstances, since a more linear GTA style game which has a tighter narrative would be interesting, but the lack of polish getting more and more obvious as the game ages makes it hard. But if you played and enjoyed it when it came out, I can see why you would consider it an underrated classic. Not to be a contrarian, but when it was released as a side story for the Mario 3D World port on Switch, I saw Bowser's Fury got a pretty good reception, but when I played it through, it all just felt a little bare. As a proof of concept for an open setting Mario 3D platformer, I think it works, but if you look at it in isolation, it feels a bit empty. The platforming was fun enough, but it lacked the pacing and sense of momentum you get from a more linear level of 3D Mario, like the ones in 3D World. And the setting, while it had some charm early on, just didn't have much going on and felt like a bunch of 3D platforming areas were just mashed together in one map. The intermittent Bowser boss fights were fine, but since it was the same thing made nominally harder throughout the game's short run, it quickly started to become repetitive. It was a cute idea, and getting to see more Bowser Jr. is always a great thing. And while yes, maybe this idea could work with some tweaking on a bigger scale, it would need a bit more going on than there is in Bowser's Fury. As a revival of Saints Row, I think we all know that Saints Row 2022 failed miserably, enough to be the final failure of their studio, but looking at it by itself, I think it's massively overhated. That's not to say it's an amazing game, but it had some fun moments, tightly paced missions, and characterization which was surprisingly engaging. The core cast from this game was one of the biggest criticisms I'd seen for the story, and while they are imperfect, especially in isolation, the friendship between them and how this developed throughout the campaign was really fun to watch. I didn't take my time with Saints Row 2022, especially since it did pale in comparison to how much fun I had playing 4 a few years ago, and I could tell my willingness to play the game would wane as time went on. In spite of this, I did indulge in some side content, and one of the best moments by far is the LARPing side quest, which has your character and the gang get involved in Santo Eliso's live-action role-playing scene, raiding cardboard bases, fake assassinations, and mock weapons. It was definitely a highlight of the campaign and an unfortunately short look at the more wacky moments that made the previous Saints Row games more fun, even if the final cutscene for the mission completely bugged out. There are plenty of issues with this game, and they've all been closely documented, and when this game failed I was massively disappointed due to how much I enjoyed previous entries, but this game is far from the irredeemable dog shit some fans make it out to be. At the start of this year, I almost played One Piece Odyssey when it released, since a turn-based One Piece adventure looked like a lot of fun, but I missed the boat and didn't end up picking it up until a mid-year sale, but at that point I didn't want to play it since I was catching up with the main series and didn't want to get burned out by oversaturating myself with One Piece content. So by the time I caught up to the series and had left it for a little while, I was ready to play a One Piece game. So what did I pick? Shonen Jump's One Piece for Game Boy Advance. This beat-em-up platformer hybrid is a unique artifact, being the first One Piece game ever released outside of Japan, but also not being a localized game. This is in fact an original game made exclusively for the North American release using assets from previous Japan-exclusive One Piece games. It was made to cross-promote with the infamous One Piece 4Kids dub. The game luckily misses out on all of the issues people had with this version of the anime, since the game doesn't have any of the memorable voice acting,
Luffy! It's good to see you, buddy!
And doesn't have any of the censorship either, with the only real remnants being Zoro called Zolo and Chaser instead of Smoker. The game itself is short, splitting the first 50 episodes or 100 chapters into 6 levels, split into 2 stages and a boss each. The gameplay is a little awkward sometimes, with some bosses and platforming sections feeling a little unfair, especially when you have a life system in place, but if like me you're using save states, then it's nowhere near as much of a problem. The nostalgia for this early saga of One Piece was lacking a little since the live action adaptation just came out recently and covered the exact same stories in a lot more detail, but as a throwback it's an entertaining and short licensed game that's refreshing if you're craving something One Piece but you don't want to play a Warriors game or a long RPG. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is technically a very good game. It's a creative 3D platformer that clearly had a lot of love and time put into it, and it's very competently crafted and put together, but it was just clearly made for a very young audience. I would usually be an advocate for games being for everyone and you can enjoy whatever you want, but there is something about the aesthetic of the Little Big Planet universe's style which I just don't resonate with, and almost find it patronising. I don't know if it's the narration or random British celebrities being brought in to voice act, but I just don't vibe with it, which sucks because I was playing through this incredibly well-paced, well-designed adventure thinking I should be enjoying this, but something about it just made me glaze over and go with emotions. I was making a conscious effort to get through a lot of my PS Plus backlog this year, so that's why I pushed myself to reach credits, but if I wasn't pushing myself to get my money's worth from a subscription I'm about to cancel, I would have probably dropped it a bit earlier. There's a good chance that if you enjoy 3D platformers, you'll enjoy this, but that unfortunately wasn't the case for me. After picking up the Analog Pocket in December, I was on the lookout for oddball GBA games which I never considered playing. That was the reason I played One Piece, and discovered Korean Paradise. The first game in the series is more accessible, with it being available on Nintendo Switch Online, but this one, which has been heralded as the best in the series, was a Japanese exclusive and therefore not translated. In my years of gaming, I've never tried to play a game without English text, but I assume that since this game has such a simple and satisfying concept that I wouldn't run into any issues. And to be honest, for the most part I didn't. Compared to long plays that I've checked, I played most of the levels, which have a cute 2000s cartoon aesthetic and got quite challenging in spite of appearances. But at some point the progression to unlock some final levels required beating some pretty janky minigames, so I just gave up, especially since I couldn't peruse the menus to work out what I was missing. With how much fun I had even though I couldn't understand anything, the game deserves praise. It's also nice to play a fun little simple concept game like this, which if it was made now, 21 years later, it would be a free-to-play mobile game with over 2,000 levels and a microtransaction life system forcing you to pay up if you want more than 5 minutes of playtime. Back in June, it was a Nintendo Online Platinum Point mission to play Kirby Tilt and Tumble, and since the rewards aren't as trash as they used to be, I tried it out. Similarly to Kururin, it's a simple concept game that wouldn't really get made nowadays, and the motion control gimmick was actually put to good use, even if it is undeniably a gimmick. Nintendo essentially saw those plastic roller toys where you get the tiny ball through the maze and thought, what if it was Kirby? I can imagine this game would have been pretty infuriating natively on the Game Boy with the original life and game over system, but the pacing was a lot better with save states, otherwise I likely wouldn't have got nearly as far as I did. It was nothing jaw-dropping, but I can see how at release the motion controls would have been more impressive, but in a post-Wii world, that glimmer is obviously lacking now. A fun distraction to play amidst longer games, and for free, it's hard to complain when it was so well emulated by Nintendo on the Switch. And just one spot above, the motion-controlled Kirby spin-off is Game of the Year 2015 winner The Witcher 3. I think if I played this in 2015 I would have had a lot more fun, and while I know that a lot of people still love this game, I just couldn't get into it. And not for lack of effort. I got a third of the way through the massive story, tried plenty of side quests, tried Gwent, and put in over 20 hours, but after that and seeing how much I still had ahead of me, I just had to give it an indefinite break. While the world looks amazing with the next gen update and exploring it was often a lot of fun, I just didn't really enjoy playing it that much. With the power of retrospect, I recognise that my main issue was the lack of development in Geralt's abilities. Almost everything he could do 20 hours in was something he could do 1 hour in, and while his numbers were bigger thanks to leveling up and getting new gear, since everything else was scaling around him, playing it didn't really feel that different at all. And while the world looks amazing, I'm not really a fan of low fantasy that much, so I was never too tempted to get lost and just explore. Aside from how intangible the progression in Geralt's abilities felt, most of my issues with The Witcher 3 are mostly superficial and based on taste. I just don't think I was in the place to spend so many more hours on a game which I enjoyed for a while but was quickly losing the momentum to keep me engaged. Out of all the games on this list that I've dropped, this is the one I can see myself most likely to return to, but probably not that soon. Endless Dungeon is a lot of things, being both a tower defense game, a genre I usually enjoy but rarely go out of my way for, and a twin stick shooter, a genre I'd barely played before. But it's also structured like a roguelite, a genre I either love or hate. And there is a lot I loved about Endless Dungeon, but also enough holding it back that it dragged itself this far down the list. The combination of the three core genres works quite well for a while, and even though the runs can be quite long, they are relatively well paced, and the gameplay was often pretty satisfying, if not a little repetitive, no matter which character I was using. A noticeable issue I ran into was bugs, which was a massive disappointment. The most obvious, which is a widespread issue for almost every player on certain consoles, is whenever you would try and level up the crystal bot, which is a tower which you're defending, during your run, the game would crash. Since it autosaves regularly, the run wouldn't be lost, but losing a whole system of progression in each run was an unnecessary limitation that took so long to fix that by the time it was, I'd long since abandoned the game. On top of this, while the pacing of each run was fine, the pacing of the overarching narrative was incredibly slow, and practically crawled to a halt at a certain point. The difficulty was less on a slope and more of a cliff face, requiring massive amounts of time and effort to get to the ending right at the point where the game had ran out of new content to give you. Issues like this will likely be fixed, but playing Endless Dungeon in its launch era felt incredibly demoralizing. And while the first half of the game was a lot of fun, there was little to no motivation to push through to the ending. Side note worth mentioning though, the soundtrack was so good, perfectly matching the environment and atmosphere of each level, so it's a shame that so few people are going to get to properly appreciate it since this game never really took off, and in the state it's in, I doubt it will. I kind of thought I was a little bit of a disgrace of a so-called Nintendo fan for not having played any Star Fox games, even if it was one of their more overlooked IPs in the last decade, so when I saw the 3DS remake of the most popular entry in the series, I thought I would try it out. In the course of a day, I did one playthrough and it was absolutely fine. It was a great looking game on the 3DS with a lot of effort clearly having gone into smoothing it out from the N64 original, and the choice of different levels was a nice variety which gives me a good incentive to maybe pick it up again one day. But after one playthrough, I'd had my fill. I was perfectly satiated and happy to move on. It's a shame that rail shooters are a dying breed, since games like this are a lot of fun, and their potential is clear with amazing games like Kid Icarus Uprising pushing the limits for what they can achieve. I don't want to compare Star Fox 64 to one of my all-time favourites, since the original is 20 years older, so I won't, since it's honestly unfair. Even if this game didn't blow my mind, I appreciate how it impacted the genre and laid foundations for even better games to come. Compared to a lot of the games below it on the list, I think Trek to Yomi has a lot more technical failings, but also, in a reversal of Sackboy, I just enjoyed what it was going for more, and that redeemed a lot of its more objective issues. The strong style was amplified by the forced camera angles that ensure you're getting the best view of each part of the setting you traverse through. The linear design meant the pacing was pretty great as well, even if it sometimes grinded to a halt in some challenging areas, with too long between checkpoints forcing you to replay long sections. The combat was simple but effective, and since it wasn't too complex, it fit the game's short runtime perfectly. It did start to wear a little thin in later levels, but just as I was starting to get over it, the game was wrapping up. I've seen a lot of people accuse it of being completely style over substance, and I think that stems from the linear design and simple combat, which is understandable, but for me that doesn't really ruin a game, it just simply makes it more linear. If it looks like the kind of thing you'll enjoy, especially if you like Kurosawa films, then give it a try, especially if it's on sale. But on the same hand, if it doesn't seem like your thing at all, then it's easy to skip. It's pretty criminal that the last Punch-Out game is almost 15 years old with no signs of a sequel on the horizon. In spite of this, thanks to the timeless art style and intuitive controls of the latest entry from back on the Wii, it's still accessible and fun to go back to. If you've ever been tempted to try Punch-Out, this is where I'd recommend you start, with the animations looking amazing and the difficulty scaling perfectly to help you get better. But I had one main issue, and that was with saving. The game is split into 3 leagues with 4 matches in the first 2 and then 5 on the third, and you can only save once you've finished a league. With the game's difficulty, these fights that unless you're a prodigy will take multiple attempts, and especially in the last league can take a lot of time to get past. This really sucks since you're essentially held captive by the game until you finish a league, unless you want to lose what could be a massive chunk of gameplay. This is likely a throwback to this series' old school origins, but if you want a throwback, put that in presentation or gameplay, not in missing out on pretty foundational quality of life features. It made approaching play sessions pretty intimidating since I knew I would be stuck playing for a while, especially on that last challenge with 5 consecutive fights to learn and perfect. The game would be so much higher if it didn't have this issue, and I'm hoping it gets a port which remedies it, or just a well-deserved sequel at this point. You might remember Daemon X Machina as that game which got a pretty big announcement trailer at Nintendo's E3 in 2018, the same one which spent most of its time on Smash Ultimate. And while the trailer never convinced me to buy the game, when it was being given away for free on Epic Games Store, I thought I'd at least try it, even if that meant having to use their launcher. The core mech gameplay was actually a lot of fun, and it didn't take long for speeding around the stylized interactive maps to feel completely natural. This gameplay being fun is what pushed me through to the end, with some interesting missions and most bosses being a spectacle-filled challenge. Luckily the game wasn't too long, so the core gameplay was fresh enough to last the whole runtime, but not by much since the time I had dealt with the slightly cheap final boss, I was ready to retire. The storytelling was also completely off the wall. I tried to keep up with it near the start, but more and more characters kept getting introduced, to the point where I felt it was a joke that the cast had grown to over 20. With so much random shit being thrown around with this massive cast of characters that have barely any discernible traits, the context for the missions quickly got tuned out and eventually skipped altogether. If you can find it for a good deal and you've never played a mech game like this, I would honestly recommend it as a good starting point. But if you're looking for an engaging story or really anything aside from the mech gameplay, then look elsewhere. When the gameplay of Fast RMX hits, it hits hard and is a lot of fun to play through, and since it's a game without any context, just gameplay, it didn't take nearly as much of my time. However, because of that complete lack of context, it meant that it also lacked any personality, and means I'm even more critical of the gameplay since that's all it has. And like I said, that core gameplay is fun, putting its own spin on the F-Zero formula with a color-coded boosting mechanic that adds an extra layer to concentrate on when playing. But once I'd played every track, done well enough in every cup, unlocked all the cars, I just didn't feel much reason to keep going. I'd hit credits, played with some friends, and just felt like I'd seen all there is to see. It's a strong racing game I'll return to whenever I have time to kill and access to my Switch, but because of the difficulty, it's quite hard to just introduce to most friends in a casual setting, which for a racing game severely limits how much I'm going to get out of it. This is my third foray into the Monster Hunter series, and the first time I played it truly as God intended, multiplayer. That means the repetition inherent to the series didn't set in as quickly and meant that missions were a lot more fun and engaging to complete, but it also meant that I'd finally realised my issues with Monster Hunter might be a bit deeper than just not having people to play it with. For context, I played 4 Ultimate back on the 3DS and Rise last year, and a trend I've noticed is each time I've played them less and less. I put hours upon hours into 4, went quite far past the credits in Rise, but after getting to the credits of World and having seen most of the monsters included, I just didn't feel the need to keep going. Even with the streamlining world added to the Monster Hunter series, the lack of motivation to keep playing was still obvious. With this being my third time trying the series, noticing the loop of better gear for harder monsters to better gear became noticeable even quicker. If that's fun for you and you love the more intricate character building, extra difficulty aspects of the Monster Hunter series, then that probably sounds amazing, but for a more casual fan, that just doesn't appeal. Even though the teasers for the next Monster Hunter title look impressive, this time I'm going to abstain for longer, so by the next time I return to the series I can come at it from a much fresher perspective. As a massive Bayonetta fan, I went into Astral Chain with slight reservation but high expectations, and it mostly delivered. The core combat system was great, with the different legions you unlock throughout the game all feeling different and fun to use, and incentivized trying out different styles. The unique gameplay with the legions also had some fun overlap with the overworld exploration, which often led to some interesting traversal and platforming sections. My main issue with Astral Chain is a lack of editing when it came to what to include in the final game. It's one of those games which you'll remember fondly and maybe want to revisit, but then you'll remember, oh, I don't want to do that section. And unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of what that section might be. It could be drawn out investigation sequences, stealth sections that just overstay their welcome, and even a couple whole chapters that just kill the pacing of the entire game. I like what Platinum were going for with something slower paced than Bayonetta, where you can explore, backtrack, and take your time with side content, and when that worked, it worked well, but when it missed, it just felt incredibly unsatisfying. I took a massive hiatus from Astral Chain because I was tired of how long it was taking me to get through, and since the narrative wasn't particularly strong, especially the closer I got to the conclusion, I just didn't feel the need to continue, but I picked it back up and pushed to the end, but essentially ignored all side content and just fast tracked to the end. I'll fondly remember the good parts of Astral Chain because there were plenty of them, but I hope a sequel will build upon the strong foundations and create a better, more refined experience. Spoilers to my game ranking from last year, but the 2020 remake of Final Fantasy VII was the best thing I played all year, so going back to that setting for the Intergrade DLC was something I was massively excited for, and it didn't really disappoint me that much since I got to formally meet Yuffie, who is a lot of fun, and go on a short but interesting enough adventure with her teasing the next entry in the remake trilogy, and my favourite character from the main story, Roche, even had a cameo. It feels slightly superficial, but my main issue with this quite short campaign was the setting. A highlight of 7 Remake was how amazing all of the different areas in Midgar looked, so when Intergrade largely retreaded the same areas, only really adding some new sections to existing areas, or an extended factory trip, I just couldn't help but be a bit let down. The gameplay was still fun, but the sense of exploration and progression felt so stagnant compared to the main game, and makes us feel like it just blends in. You would think that a new story made for the PS5 would take full advantage of the extra graphical capabilities, but looking at Intergrade, you wouldn't really think that. As an extension to what is now one of my favourite games ever, I can't help but feel that it just didn't do enough to be worth the extra cost to play it. The start of Ghostwire Tokyo was honestly some of the most fun I've had in an open world game in recent memory, and that's with a first person game which I usually don't enjoy as much. The atmosphere was palpable, the combat was satisfying, and best of all, the way you explore and interact with the detailed environments was so much fun. The areas were all packed with little secrets and encouraged going out of your way, and since your character is perfectly balanced, you have to be a little stealthy. Not the annoying oppressive kind of stealth sections you want to be over, but the natural stealthiness that just makes you feel more aware of your environment. Some of the areas and missions I completed in these early hours were some of the best I played this year, and I still remember those sections of the map vividly. But then, after not very long, you'll start to learn more abilities, get more powerful, and be able to traverse every area with ease. Usually, this kind of growth makes open world games more satisfying, since it's nice to be able to blast through areas you'd struggled with, but in this case, it came far too soon. It felt like there was a clear point where I'd stopped engaging with the setting as much as I had to, because my abilities meant I could fly up any building, skip any street, and fast travel wherever I needed to be. It went from being one of the most engaging open world games I'd played in years to another standard go to the marker on the map and do the task then repeat, which is a massive downgrade. By the last third of the game I was doing the bare minimum, just going to main story markers, skipping side content and not interacting with the environment as much, because I just didn't need to. Not to say that the end of the game was awful, but I was way less invested and kind of just sad that a game that has started so strong was let down by poorly paced progression. I'm sure that you might be able to have some more fun if you self-impose some limitations, but if you're playing in a vacuum and you don't have any context, you wouldn't know that you should do that. I've heard rumours of a sequel, and since the game's faults would be quite easy to fix, I hope that they can nail that with a follow-up. A genre of games which I often overlook is party games, since it's easy to default to Smash or Mario Kart and call it a day. But while it flopped sales-wise, Nintendo might have unintentionally made the Wii U to be the perfect console for party games, with one of the most fun being Game & Wario. The game is unfortunately quite hard to come by since it was underprinted and the Wii U eShop is now down, but if you can find it, I would highly recommend checking it out. Like a lot of other games from early in the Wii U's life, it takes full advantage of the system's unique qualities to make each of its minigames something you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. A clear standout is Islands, or as it's more lovingly referred to, Fronk, which requires players catapulting their Fronks from the gamepad to islands on the screen and trying to score enough points while also trying to knock off other players' Fronks. It's also got a drawing game, which is a much more efficient version of Pictionary, with the drawing sent directly from the gamepad to the screen, making guessing a lot more practical. I also appreciate that multiplayer games don't require you to own multiple Wii remotes and only use a gamepad, since that's a problem with a lot of other multiplayer Wii U titles. But the multiplayer is the main issue with the game as well. Out of the selection of minigames you can play, only 4 of them use multiplayer, with the others being solo only. So while taking turns on minigames can be fun when hanging out with certain friends, games like this tend to thrive more when the interactivity and social element is more encouraged. As well as this, some minigames are just nowhere near as fun as others, with some of them feeling very simple and not worth revisiting. But for the better games included and wacky presentation Wario games often have, and of course, Fronks, it deserves to get more appreciation. Earlier on I spoke about Saints Row 2022 actually just being average instead of awful, and a step up from that is Immortals of Avium being seen as below average when it's actually a pretty strong title which is well worth trying out. I was interested in playing it since launch, since a magic-based shooter seems interesting as well as the fantasy setting it presented, but since it was selling as a full price £70 product, I waited, and since its reviews were underwhelming, it very quickly discounted. So by late December, only 3 months after release, with a small rewards point voucher, I was able to get it down to just £5, and for that cost at least, I had plenty of fun. Of course, I would have been a lot more critical if I paid full price, but I would have happily paid more for the experience I got. The main criticism it received was for its occasionally cringeworthy writing, commonly compared to MCU level humour, and while yes, these moments are a bit hard to watch, but if you can ironically appreciate it, then that aspect is a lot more bearable. And even if the dialogue wasn't that well written, the overarching narrative was quite well told, and since it was kept simple enough as well, it was easy to follow. But aside from the minor issues with the writing, the combat and gameplay itself was a lot of fun. It only takes about 10 hours to complete, and since the progression is kept quite linear, it's paced very well too. But if you want it to last longer, there are plenty of opportunities for backtracking and spending more time exploring. The combat never gets old since you're consistently given new abilities, and the skill tree progresses quite quickly, especially if you explore and get bonus XP. It's honestly a great action game with a beautiful world, and while the characters have some cringy lines, that doesn't make the game irredeemable. I bought this game when it launched on Switch in 2018, and soon after I played a few levels on a train journey. An awful idea, since while it was fun, it also made me super nauseous, and I struggled getting to grips with the controls on some laggy detached Joy-Cons, staring at the tiny screen popped up on a wobbly train chair. All in all, it put me off for half a decade, but in 2023 I put it behind me and tried again, and shock horror, but Katamari is fun. It's just an enjoyable, satisfying idea which could be too easy, but is well balanced with time limits and certain goals which stop it from being a pushover. Part of what motivated me to revisit this title is the apparently better sequel has now been remade and ported too, so I thought I should at least complete the original first. The presentation is quirky and the game is good at letting you progress at your own pace, and once I reached credits I would have happily kept playing the side content. But since I now have the sequel, I thought I should hold off until I play that so I don't oversaturate my Katamari enjoyment. I hope the remake for the sequel will be just as fun to play in 2024, and I also hope it performs well enough that the other titles will get ported as well. At the end of my 2022 ranking, I gave a quick prediction of what I'll enjoy most the next year. One was the next part of the Final Fantasy VII remake, which ended up getting delayed, and the other was Tears of the Kingdom. And while I enjoyed parts of it, I also happened to enjoy 40 other games more than it, which as you can imagine, I didn't expect. Part of me actually wants to put it a little lower since I was so disappointed in it as such a big fan of Breath of the Wild, but I couldn't in good faith say it was actually worse than the games below it. My main issue is what was done in the 6 years between this game and Breath of the Wild. I saw some people say that it was impressive that this game managed to be made in 6 years, and while I get that the melding system and Super Hand would have taken a lot of effort, when it comes to actual changes made to the world, it definitely feels like not enough was done to make retreading the map worth it. Sure, there are the sky areas and then the underground areas, but after a certain amount of exploration you realise that while they are big, they have a lot of repeated or very similar puzzles or sections that make going between them pretty unrewarding. And this being made worse since the game shares one of the main problems with Breath of the Wild, with loot and treasure just not being that exciting, made a little worse this time with a lot of repeated costumes too. And in the overworld, very few areas had meaningful differences, with only a few changes made in the areas I explored, and a lot of the changes being temporary, with how after beating the dungeons, the towns will just revert to exactly how they were in Breath of the Wild. The world just felt so similar, and sure I could make a car or an aircraft to make traversing it faster, but unfortunately the gimmick of that wore a little thin quite soon as well. Of course, that depends on personal taste, but being able to make vehicles on command whenever I want isn't worth a map that's from 2017 with some glitter shaken over it. I spent 70 hours exploring about half of the map and doing a little over half of the story, but with how often I was taking breaks to go do the underworld or explore sky areas, I was progressing the map even slower than I did in Breath of the Wild, and it just made it feel so bloated. Sure, I could have rushed around to fast track the story, which also didn't remedy the storytelling issues Breath of the Wild had, but that's a whole other problem. But if I did this, then it would feel like I was missing out on the few new areas this game offered. It's not an original talking point to say that Tears of the Kingdom serves as an amazing expansion pass to Breath of the Wild, but the more I think about it, the more that rings true. I'll likely go back soon, maybe even next year to finish it, and I might even make a follow-up video articulating these modelled up thoughts better, but for now, for my own sake, I'll stop bullying Link, since there's a lot here to enjoy. But I'm hoping that whenever I play a new Zelda game, it's in a drastically different Hyrule. From the most high-profile first-party Nintendo release of the year to one of the more low-key. The remake of Return to Dreamland was released in a dead patch in spring, and it pretty much delivers all it promises. It's a polished, slightly stylized remake of the original Return to Dreamland on Wii, which is already a perfectly good Kirby game on its own right, but now made a lot more accessible. I enjoy Kirby 2D platformers, and since this one was created with multiplayer in mind, it was made even more fun thanks to it. However, after Forgotten Land from last year was so strong, this one just pales since it's a lot more simple and a remake of a game which is a decade older. Kirby is great, but I don't think games like this are ever going to be life-changing. But it's good, sweet fun, which is easy to approach and even more enjoyable with friends. But don't go in expecting to be surprised by anything. Unless you've never experienced a Kirby story before, then you'll at least get a little shock around the end.
Me? Gungaga.
Like Kirby Return to Dreamland, I'm happy this remake got made to make it more accessible to a new generation, and it's faithful to the original, but almost to a fault. There are some minor changes made, but the gameplay seems to be quite similar to the original, and that's a good thing since it was a lot of fun, and Zack is an incredibly fun protagonist to follow. Even if some of the intricacies of the story got a little lost on me, the story did a good job of introducing me to Zack, and I think that's what its main role was. It of course looks a lot better than the PSP original, and the new cutscenes look great, but there were some sections where it's clear that the new look was a priority over the actual animations. So while at some points the game looked amazing, some animations jarringly reminded me that the game is a lot older than it looks. To iron these issues out, the game would have needed some more time in the oven, but I understand why Square wanted this out in between the first two parts of the Final Fantasy VII Remake to properly contextualize Zack, so for that I can't really fault it. However, it was a little rough at some points because of it. In spite of this, the chapter structure of the game helped the pacing massively, and gave me clear points to take breaks and walk away, which I always appreciate. It also had plenty of side content to indulge in if I wanted to slow down my pace or just make Zack a bit stronger. I'm happy I went on my way to play it since it just made me even more hyped for Rebirth in February, but it's a shame it might have been a little rushed. Even though the Professor Layton games have always been cheap and accessible, I've avoided them. It's probably because I've always been pretty bad at brain teasers since my brain just doesn't seem to work that way, and I didn't want to have to look up solutions. But this year I saw the first entry, The Curious Village, being sold for a steal, so I finally took the plunge and tried it. And it pleasantly surprised me. The puzzles were mostly fun and just required focusing and some proper concentration, and they wouldn't take too long. With some I used hint coins, and I very rarely had to seek help outside of the game, but playing through these puzzles was a fun method of progression. The setting of the village also looked amazing on the DS and held up incredibly well, made even better was the sporadic animated scenes bringing the charming and intriguing story to life. I honestly regret avoiding this series for so long, and luckily almost every other entry is just as cheap, so I'm looking forward to working my way through the sequels and learning more about these characters. It's hard to describe Pikuniku. It's technically a platformer, but paced like an exploration, adventure style game. Whatever it is, I had a great time for the couple of hours it took me to reach its conclusion. Pikuniku was made so much better by the writing being fully self-aware, making the journey all the more entertaining and building on the charming and goofy energy it established. There were some minor puzzle solving sections, but it was really just one of those games where you mess about and you'll eventually work out what you're doing, and will likely achieve your goals accidentally by just having fun. This style of game usually gets old quick, so the fact that the developers were aware of this and kept the pacing tight and story short was appreciated. Saying that, I would happily play a sequel made by the same team, even in the same style, since I played this all the way at the start of the year, and games with this unique energy don't come along too often. Compared to something like The Pathless, which seemed a bit confused with whether it wanted to be minimalist or indulge in exposition, Sayonara Wild Hearts, published by Annapurna Interactive as well, masters the more minimalist storytelling throughout its short runtime. The storytelling doesn't focus on details but more on feelings, and this fits a flashy rhythm game with an intense soundtrack like this perfectly. I sometimes struggle to play a game in one sitting, even if it's short, but with how well Sayonara Wild Hearts was paced and how simple it was to just go on to the next level, I did it easily. For a game so short, challenge can sometimes be a struggle since developers might not want to force you to get good for a game which you'll be done within an afternoon, but the strict grading system in Sayonara Wild Hearts meant you could always progress, but also incentivized coming back to do better. With a game so short, the conversation of how much a game should cost for how long it takes often comes up. This is actually quite prevalent this year, with Marvel's Spider-Man 2 being a little controversial for taking less than 30 hours to 100% and being full price. And while Sayonara Wild Hearts is a lower example, the 2-hour adventure costing around £15 full price is comparable. It's a tricky discussion since it depends on how you gauge worth, and also if you think you're going to replay a game, or on the other hand resell it. That's why it took me so long to take the plunge with Sayonara Wild Hearts, since even though I knew it was the kind of thing I would enjoy, I couldn't be sure if it would be worth it. But when I found a physical copy, which I didn't even know existed, for half the digital price, it was an easy buy. So, if you're unsure if this is the kind of thing you'll enjoy, I was right about my suspicions and my guess that I would enjoy this based on trailers and footage. But if you're still unsure, then get it in a format that will be easy to resell just in case. When I was talking about Game & Wario, I mentioned how the Wii U is the ideal party game machine, and Nintendo Land is an extension of that. I was really getting into gaming around the time the Wii U launched, and I remember seeing a lot of footage of Nintendo Land since it was a launch title, but it took me over a decade to actually play it myself with some friends, and I'm happy to say it doesn't disappoint and also holds up well too. Similarly to Game & Wario, it's a minigame collection, but this one uses the genius idea of basing each of the 12 off an iconic or not so iconic Nintendo IP. Unfortunately, only half are multiplayer, still a better ratio than Game & Wario, but all of them are a lot of fun and perfect for pick up and play multiplayer with friends no matter the gaming expertise, which is exactly what I was looking for. It's full of charm, like the game recording your face on the gamepad, catching unintentionally funny moments, and attention to detail with little Easter eggs and references hidden throughout the hub and each of the minigames. It's a shame Nintendo has stepped away from making games like this and using Miis as avatars, since it worked so well as a system. Sure, you can still make Miis on the Switch if you want, but their uses are limited. I honestly think Nintendo started to step away from them after the Wii U failed as some kind of punishment. But that's a shame since the alternatives like the unnerving avatars from the new sports game, or whatever 1-2 Switch and its sequel are going for, just don't hit the same. This is also a great way for Nintendo to reference their legacy and give tidbits to fans of more obscure series, and I wish they did something similar for the launch of the Switch, since anything would have been better than 1-2 Switch. It does feel a bit like low-hanging fruit going after 1-2 Switch almost 7 years after its launch, since it's been a punching bag essentially since it came out, but when Nintendo Land was such a strong launch title for the previous console, I think it's good to try and remind Nintendo to go for something more like this than that. I don't know why I went into Guardians of the Galaxy with such low expectations. I think that it might be something to do with my perceptions slightly being clouded by the wave of hate it got for dominating Square's E3 presentation with a bloated demo a couple of years ago, but upon actually playing it, I was happily surprised with how much fun I had. Guardians of the Galaxy is just another piece of my linear games are actually really good opinion I've been building up throughout the year, and it also reminded me why I like these characters. Like a lot of people, I was introduced to these characters with the MCU movies, and while I like those a lot, my opinion of them has been dragged down by my growing disinterest in the MCU as a whole. So, having this game recreate that sense of fun these characters incensed in their earlier appearances was weirdly nostalgic. With its linear levels, each setting looked amazing, and feels like a roller coaster with how you're on track, but everything is tailored for you to have as much fun as possible. It does feel a little unfair defining this game by its linear nature, since one of the top selling points was being able to make choices, and while these were fun, they felt a little bit more like minor role-playing than an actual mechanic. The story was also well told, and while I went in worried that the characters looking and sounding slightly different would feel uncanny, but the characterization was so good I didn't really notice. In fact, this douchier version of Star-Lord felt a little more fitting compared to whatever not Italian Mario was going for in the movies. If you like engaging and story-focused action games with RPG-style linear progression, or if you just miss the dynamic of the OG Guardians of the Galaxy, then I would recommend trying this, especially since I think very few people remember or even talk about this game, and it's quickly going from being just underrated to almost forgotten. My original untainted opinion of the first Atelier Ryza game is now a little harder to remember since, if you watch the first part, you'll know it's tainted by how much less I enjoyed the sequel. So I now have a permanent set of rose-tinted glasses glued on when talking about it, which I'll try to pry off by not just talking about how much I preferred it to the follow-up. However, the strength of Atelier Ryza, Everdarkness and the Secret Hideout is in its metered ambition and well-paced introduction to the alchemy system. The story is slow-paced and the lack of intense stakes for most of its runtime helps to relax a player and make approaching the game easy. And while the alchemy system seems complex at first, because it is, the game gives you achievable tasks that slope harder throughout the game while also introducing new systems that give you more options, and eventually make you feel more empowered. I mentioned it in the first part as well, but I really enjoy this core set of 4 characters we meet in the first game, and while I do wish we got to see a few more interactions between the characters aside from Ryza herself, focusing more on Ryza made her a more likeable protagonist, and that's why her lack of focus in the sequel bothered me. Do you see what I mean? I can't help but compliment this game and miss it because the follow-up is just categorically worse, from my perspective at least. Maybe once I eventually force myself to finish the second game and then move on to the hopefully better final part of the trilogy, I'll go back and make a self-contained retrospective, but for now I can't help but be stuck inadvertently insulting the sequel and perhaps overpraising the original. From my nostalgic relationship with Atelier Ryza 1 to my confused relationship with Persona 5, we have my complex but positive opinion on its spin-off slash sequel slash epilogue Persona 5 Strikers. I loved playing through Persona 5 Royal a couple of years ago, but after playing it I became a little jaded seeing it overrated since while it's a good time, I think its fans treat it as a far more mature story than it actually is, and my own likely nostalgia fueled bias towards Persona 4, but that's another topic. Aside from that, I still enjoy the Phantom Thieves, so I knew I would eventually return and play the conclusion to their story. I enjoy Musou style spin-offs, but I was surprised with just how well this melded the Persona gameplay with it, and it made for a much less mindless experience than I expected. The story was also more guided and varied, but also way less formulaic than expected, and since the campaign was so much shorter than the baseline Persona 5, only taking around 30 hours to complete compared to 100, I found myself having no trouble getting immersed in a fast-paced play session. I don't love the Persona trend of having to introduce new one-off characters for every spin-off, since I think it's a cop-out from having to further develop the pre-established characters we already have. But again, I was shocked that both of the new characters were entertaining, and while I would have liked more time with the main cast, the fact that they each got their own moment was at least something. The road trip format was a great method for keeping the pace up and gave the game a distinct identity from the original, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I think I put off Strikers for too long because I was worried it would just be a Persona 5 Musou game, but because the developers put clear effort into giving it a distinct identity, I managed to have more fun than I expected. I've left Persona 5 Strikers with an improved image of the original game, this game, and the series as a whole, and while I'm not going to jump right into other spin-offs like Tactica, I'm going to be more excited for when I eventually will. Similarly to Atelier Ryza 1 and 2, this is part of a franchise I'm going to talk about out of order, only now it's a little more complex since this year I played, in order, Resident Evil 4 Remake, then 2 Remake, then 3 Remake, but also took a massive break in the middle, only finishing it quite recently. So while I played the games out of order, I'm further mixing it up thanks to ranking them out of order as well. Even if 3 Remake is my least favourite of the 3 entries I played this year, I still had a great time working through it. It's just in a slightly weird position, being between 2 games which I preferred. And that feeling is accentuated since it also feels like a hybrid of 2 and 4 in how it's paced and structured. The overall narrative is about the same length of one playthrough of 2, but the areas you explore, especially later in the game, are more linear like they are in 4. This meant that it never ended up being able to properly play to either of the strengths those titles had, since it feels like it's straddling a different approach in the middle. What I did love was how structured the story was and how you switch between Jill and Carlos at set intervals. The opening streets and the hospital were some of my favourite areas to explore, maybe because they reminded me of some of 2's best areas, but one negative compared to the other two is that the story felt a little weaker because of a lack of more threatening antagonist. Nemesis starts off threatening, but the more he transforms, even if he was getting stronger, he felt less imposing. And Nikolai was clearly a bad guy, but it felt like he was a little underdeveloped, so I never really cared about what he was doing, and since there isn't a real boss battle with him, I didn't ever perceive him as a threat. In spite of all these negative comparisons I'm making to 2 and 4, 3 Remake is still a great time, and while it would definitely be an awkward starting point, if you like 2 or 4, you'll still find something to enjoy here. I spent most of July playing a long game which I'll get to later, but afterwards I wanted something fun, lighthearted and refreshing, and Lil Gator Game was exactly what I needed. It only takes about 3 hours to complete, but all 3 of those hours were spent finding secrets throughout the map full of details and fun little challenges and activities. The gameplay can best be described as Breath of the Wild light, so you can climb and platform wherever if you have enough stamina, and gliding is an option as well. I've never played a game which has so quickly had everyone else in the room wanting to have a go, so for some sections I had to relent control of Cheese Scone, the name of my crocodile, to my flatmates and let them mess around in the playground this game sets out for you. It could have easily felt too simple, but the challenges you're given require some basic puzzle solving, which is never too hard, but means you can't completely turn your brain off. But what I appreciate is that the game doesn't force you to achieve too many of the goals to progress the story, making this feel more like leisure time and less of a chore. It's also worth mentioning that the story, while simple, is incredibly sweet, and the kind of unpatronizing narrative I wish more games aimed at kids would go for. If you want something like Breath of the Wild, but way less of a commitment and a bit more goofy, then try it out. Even though I find the art style a little jarring, the Danganronpa series has always intrigued me, but I haven't played any of them since I got the story spoiled, but I might still try them at some point, since I'm sure there's a lot more to them than just the main story points. But last year I played World's End Club, a game made by the same team, and while the gameplay was below average, the storytelling was great. So when I saw the same team had a new game coming out this year with a different style of gameplay, I was hesitantly excited for it. While it was a little too slow paced for my taste, Master Detective Archive's Raincode was a lot of fun and bursting with personality. The overarching narrative and mystery was a lot of fun to uncover, and similarly to World's End Club, it's not something you'll catch on to and you'll be kept guessing the whole time. Even though the gameplay wasn't perfect, it was leagues better than World's End Club. The map, while limited, was detailed and looked great on Switch, and it was a great setting for some minor exploration for the investigations. What I didn't love were the dungeons you're transported to that allow you to uncover the truth behind a mystery. The pacing of an investigation is slowed down massively, they're bulky and take too long to get through, have repetitive designs, and they spend so long spelling out the answer that you're just begging to get to the end most of the time, especially later in the game when they get longer. In spite of that, the storytelling was strong enough to help me get through, and even though the look of the dungeons was repetitive, the overall style helped me stay engaged. The characters were alright, with some being more enjoyable than others, and unfortunately Shinigami, the companion, just got to be too much. Her character was just a bit too tropey, and even though her behaviour was supposed to be annoying and the main character calls her annoying, that doesn't mean she's any less annoying. Even though these grievances could have killed my interest in a worse game, because of how strong the other aspects of Raincode were, I was able to push through, and if it looks like the kind of thing you'll be interested in, then you'll probably enjoy it in spite of the flaws like I did. Like Raincode, Great Ace Attorney Adventures is a slower paced mystery investigation game, but it stands just above for its slightly improved pacing and more cohesive gameplay. Raincode tries a lot of things, taking advantage of being something completely new, even if that means a lot of it fails. While Great Ace Attorney Adventures is a prequel, it's a part of an established series, so its gameplay is a lot more confident in what it is, and that makes for a more enjoyable experience to get through. I also really enjoyed the cast of characters I was introduced to, with Runosuke and Herlock making perfect counters throughout the 5 chapters we get to know them. But even side characters are characterized and animated so well that the short insight we get for them is a lot of fun to see. This is my first Ace Attorney game, and I've been meaning to play it for a while, especially since a couple of friends have really got into the original trilogy, but of course I had to be awkward and go and start with the prequel. And this game looks amazing. The backgrounds are clearly crafted with love, and while the character models are 3D, they're just as expressive and full of life as traditional 2D animations like the sprites in the original series. My main issue, like with Raincode, is the pacing. A common critique I've noticed with the whole Ace Attorney series is that the trials sometimes just last a little too long, and you'll have uncovered the mystery long before you're allowed to finish. There are no shortcuts after all. While it is an entertaining one with lots of set dressing, this is still a visual novel. But it wasn't as bad as it got with Raincode, even though I still found myself occasionally mashing through dialogue at some points. The two great Ace Attorney games often get bundled together, and in most territories are often impossible to buy without the other, so most people, me included, don't notice that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is actually 2 games split into 2 sets of 5 chapters. But after finishing the first 5, the overarching narrative didn't come to an end, but a natural stopping point, so I took that as a chance to leave a cap on it and come back to the second game in the short series when I'm refreshed and ready for it. I don't know why, but I never expected to like Tokyo Mirage Sessions that much, so I was surprised when I became so obsessed with it while I was playing through. I enjoy the Fire Emblem games I've played, but never got into the main series enough to seek out spin-off content, and while I plan to play some entries in the Shin Megami Tensei series, I haven't made that dive yet, so a crossover between the two franchises shouldn't really interest me that much. But seemingly this crossover wasn't really designed for fans of those series much either, since the game seems to take just as much, if not more, inspiration from J-pop idol culture than it does the gaming series it lends from, and this unique fusion is what led me to eventually try it out. Tokyo Mirage Sessions is far from perfect. Its characters have potential, but unfortunately don't get enough development, especially the more interesting ones. The overarching narrative plays by the numbers to a fault, and the presentation, while charming, is nothing to write home about. But in spite of all of this, the core gameplay was enjoyable and fresh enough for me to want to keep going, and the temptation to continue for another catchy J-pop song helped as well. It honestly feels like a bit of a miracle this game even exists. I don't know how everything got approved and they thought there was an audience for it, but it's me. I'm the audience. In a parallel universe, this game could have failed at everything it tried in the same way I see Rune Factory 5, but it succeeds so well at core aspects, and its side aspects are charming enough to make a thoroughly enjoyable JRPG. Whether you're a fan of Shin Megami Tensei or Fire Emblem or not, since the inspirations are barely there anyway, or if you're just a fan of JRPGs or just like the look of it, Tokyo Mirage Sessions is a good time, and if you want to hear me rant about it even more, then check out my ranking of every song in the game. If you told me that between the sequel to Breath of the Wild, part of my all-time favourite gaming series, and an extreme sports open world game, I would prefer the latter, I would have pissed myself laughing at you. But here we are. That's not to say I went into Riders Republic expecting the worst. It always looked cool, and the idea of a massive stunning map drawing the best parts from multiple national parks, and while extreme sports games have never done much for me, this one had something I was interested in. So I picked it up cheap and was astounded with just how much fun I had. Working my way to races from set fast travel points made the setting feel real, and the races themselves had an amazing sense of speed, especially on bike races, but the snow sports and wingsuit events were also great to play, and had the right level of challenge as well. And not to repeat myself, but I cannot praise how great this game looks, taking full advantage of what the PS5 can do. It is worth mentioning that after trying them a couple of times, I completely abandoned going for the bike and snow trick events, since racing was just a lot more fun than trying to rack up combos under a time limit. But if you like both, then you'll get even more out of it. There are some things that could be improved with a sequel or an update, my main issue being that it's hard to find certain races on the map again after completion, since even though they're marked out and titled, it's difficult to actually know which race was which marker on the map, so a favourite or star system would have been perfect. But still, this game was a lot of fun to play through, and I can easily see myself going back to go through some races when I want something refreshing and different from the kind of thing I would usually play. Making its way into the top 25 is a remake for Resident Evil 2, which was very similar to the remake for 3, which makes sense since they were released a year apart, but I just love how well this one was structured. Me and my flatmates started off with Leon's campaign, taking turns with each death, and while it felt very different coming off of 4, I at least found the change of pace to be refreshing. The horror and survival elements also felt like they'd been turned way up, with resource management feeling tougher and more chances of enemies actually jump scaring you. Since this was a much less linear experience, it was harder to predict where anything would come from. All of the environments were detailed and looked amazing, making them a terrifying joy to explore, with the police station of course being a highlight. Both Leon and Claire were likeable protagonists, and their stories felt engaging with a much clearer antagonistic force than there was in 3. However, 2 would be a lot higher if it weren't for how the game encourages you to play. After you beat your first run, you're encouraged to play again using the other character to get the true ending. So that's what we did, since we researched and saw that some elements were shortened to make it a quicker run through. And while yes, it was quicker, it wasn't quick enough, since so many areas were revisited and required incredibly similar solutions. The start of the game isn't too rough since Claire takes quite a different approach to the police station to Leon, and after that the orphanage scenes are entirely unique to Claire. But then after this, the entire second half of the game feels almost completely copy and pasted, with only certain small sections changed to alternate cutscenes. The fact that you're repeating entire puzzle sequences completely killed the pacing and really soured my memory of the game. If you're going to lock the real ending behind a second playthrough, then leave those puzzles completed, since it completely kills the immersion that Leon and Claire are working simultaneously if the exact same puzzle needs to be completed in the same world. The first playthrough was still a great time, I just wish the complete experience was laid out differently. First of all, boo Nintendo for being incapable of properly supporting your live service games on your third attempt. I love the core gameplay of Splatoon games, and I've tried each one since the first in 2015, and while they're always fun for a while, unless you want to get competitive, there isn't too much reason to keep playing after a certain point with how infrequent and unsubstantial updates are. Aside from that, Splatoon games are getting incrementally stronger overall, and the main strength for me with Splatoon 3 was how much more effort had been put into the base game single player this time, with a more involved story and even better level and hub world design. After seeing the potential with Octo expansion for 2, I'm happy to see the narrative momentum has been maintained. For the multiplayer, it'll always be fun for a while, and this time I mostly stuck with Turf War since it's what I enjoy the most with Splatoon. And while the map rotation system still feels imperfect, the extra quality of life features included make the overall feel of the game a lot smoother. It does feel like the hub world is a little barren with not much to do, especially if you struggle to get into the card game, and this feeling is only accentuated with how bare bones the first wave of DLC looks, but I do have higher hopes for the second. It feels weird critiquing a game so heavily even though I enjoyed it so much, but because the core gameplay of Splatoon is fun, and since the sequels always feel quite minor, I'm just a bit harsh on Nintendo for not doing more with it. I really hope Wave 2 DLC fixes some of these gripes, but it's a game I'll return to regularly since the gameplay loop of Splatoon is just that strong. While I have issues with how unambitious Nintendo is with Splatoon, those issues are only heightened when looking at the modern state of Pokemon. I used to be an annual day one purchase type of fan, but ever since the Diamond and Pearl remakes coming off the tail of Sword and Shield, I've essentially been boycotting. That's not to say I don't still love elements of the franchise. For example, I just replayed Explorers of Sky earlier this year and it held up amazingly, but when it comes to the new games, I just haven't had any desire to go back. But I was still craving something similar to a mainline game, so when I saw a video mention Fangame at Pokemon Castaway, and I saw it have one of my favourite evolution lines as a starter, I couldn't really resist. It leaves you literally stranded after a plane crash and you're stuck salvaging whatever you can find and then exploring the island and learning more about the setting. I was surprised with just how strong the narrative of the game was, with some decent storytelling done more subtly through the environment instead of dumps of exposition, and while it was nothing breathtaking, it was still interesting enough to keep me guessing. And since it had a unique structure and was a lot shorter than a traditional Pokemon game, I actually didn't know what was coming next. I'm honestly ashamed that this is the first Pokemon fan game I've played, and it leaves me hopeful to try more instead of sticking with the mainline, which usually just leaves me disappointed and frustrated. Like, this franchise has so much potential for more interesting games and stories, and Pokemon Company have the resources to fund them, but they seem content putting as little time and effort into their games as possible. I could honestly rant forever, and maybe I will another time, but going back to the positive, check out Pokemon Castaway if you want something refreshing. I don't know why I went into Cult of the Lamb with such low expectations, since I'd heard pretty much nothing bad about it before. Maybe it's because I don't love town building style games, maybe it's because the presentation didn't really connect with me from the trailers I'd seen, or maybe I just assumed it would be much longer, but when I actually tried it, everything clicked. Roguelites can often feel endless and lack any sense of progression, like the second half of Endless Dungeon for example, but that was never a problem here. The runs were quick, all being about 10 minutes long, and the gameplay never felt slow or tedious. And even though I was worried about the town builder gameplay being overbearing, it instead managed to balance feeling impactful while also not needing too much attention between runs. So, while I expected to dread having to check on my cult between runs, it was something I always looked forward to since the impact it had on my character and story growth was always palpable, while also giving me a sense of customizability. And while I didn't love how the game looked in trailers, the presentation combined with the amazing soundtrack worked together to create something really unique that I love to look and listen to. The level of challenge was also perfect for me, not feeling like a pushover by any means, but also never being able to let your guard down either. And having different maps instead of a big sprawling one meant I never got tired of how it looked or the enemies. There are some more nitpicky issues I had, but nothing major, and I'm so happy that the developers are still supporting this game since I will happily return to it. Every year, for the last few years, it's been an unintentional tradition of mine to play at least one Metroidvania and get obsessed and love it, and this year is no different, with Blasphemous being the only one I played. Because I played it so early in the year and because I devoured it so aggressively, specific details are a little blurry, but I have the strong memory of just having a great time with it. It was also more on the challenging side, especially when compared to Ori and the Blind Forest and Metroid Dread, which I played the year before, and that isn't a bad thing. However, it did slightly discourage me from aiming for the true ending in my playthrough. I wanted my experience the first time to be completely blind, so I didn't look for any guidance and just got to credits in a way that felt natural. So even though I didn't reach the canonical ending, I did still have a great time working through this amazing stylized setting, not stressing about meeting certain criteria and just having a good time. The combat was snappy and satisfying, and even though I wasn't really following the story, I still found the setting engaging and just wanted to discover more of it motivated me to continue. I've seen that the sequel came out in 2023 as well, so I hope it's as good as the first one, since I'm more than happy to return to this slightly grotesque but beautiful world whenever. Mario RPG was a blur to play through, which can be accredited to its very fast pacing for an RPG, but also to the fact that I blasted through all of the story in 2 days. Even though I'd never played the original, I was aware of all the changes made in the remake, so even though I find the old art style a little more charming, all of the quality of life changes make this version preferable. Mario RPG is a weird beast since while it's formatted like an RPG, compared to genre standards it's got much less of an overarching narrative. This is a little jarring at points, but I ended up preferring the episodic character-focused style, which made approaching the game easy. Play sessions would keep getting longer since it was always tempting to keep going to get through the next short chunk of the story. And even though I do think the original has a stronger aesthetic, that doesn't mean I think the Switch version looks bad. If anything, it's impressive that the game fits modern standard while also retaining the retro look of the original, showing just how much effort went into crafting the remake. I really love the idea of Nintendo lending their IPs to genre giants, like Square Enix with their pedigree for RPGs, and making something new. While Mario is a charming and massively popular IP, I wish after the success of this remake, Nintendo would do the same for any of their other IPs, whether it's something bigger like Zelda, or more overlooked like Kid Icarus, or something random like Animal Crossing. These franchises have so much potential, and an RPG spin-off would be a great way to expand on their lore and world building. Even though part of me knows Nintendo would never do this, I can dream. One of the games I remember spending the most time with on my 4th generation iPod Touch was the port of Jet Set Radio. Even though I wasn't the best at playing it, and it was a nightmare to control with such a small touchscreen, I still remember it fondly, even if there were plenty of frustrating sections I remember running into. I never completed the game, even though I do plan to return to it at some point on Steam. However, when I saw a clear spiritual successor being made in the form of Bomb Rush Cyberfunk, I really couldn't resist. The inspiration from Jet Set Radio is obvious, with the game even sticking to the distinct graphics of a Dreamcast game, and this really helps give it a clear identity amongst modern titles. I've been on a bit of a Y2K kick this year, so this, mixed with the amazing soundtrack, gave it a strong atmosphere, with each area of the world having an impressive style. Right as I started playing it, I saw a video calling it one of their disappointments of the year, and that did worry me a little bit in the early hours that I would share that person's opinion. But luckily that didn't manifest and I had a great time. I've tried playing a few skating games similar to this before, but the controls never click with me, but the difficulty scales so well in Bomb Rush Cyberfunk that it's a fun journey to work through. The game's campaign juggles trick combos with platforming so well, and just makes each section of the map feel like a playground. The progression is satisfying in how the game will drip feed you new hints and tricks throughout the story so you can return to old areas and reach parts that you couldn't before. And one thing I really didn't expect was that the story was actually quite good. It starts off slow, but with how well it's structured, you get given story at well-paced intervals, and the cutscenes do a good job of keeping the pace and conveying information in an engaging way. It isn't the best gaming story I've played by far, but I would happily play a sequel to see more of what these characters do. It was a bit ironic that soon after I finished the story in early September that Sega teased an official reboot of Jet Set Radio, which I'm happy to see, but even if that flops, I can rest assured that the franchise's legacy lives on elsewhere. I was passively excited for Eternights since it was introduced in a state of play at some point in 2022, and while I was a little mixed on it seeing how unpolished some of the visuals were, I still ended up getting it with a physical release in November, more confident after seeing how positive the reviews were. But what shifted my perspective a little before playing it was seeing how much hate it was getting from some hardcore Persona fans due to similarities. There is some clear inspiration. It uses the calendar system to track progression and pace certain events. It encourages dating one of the love interests built up through conversations and quest, similar to social links. And I guess it has an anime art style as well. But that's really where the comparisons end. It's a lot shorter, only taking 10 hours to get through, being 2 in-game months, compared to Persona 5 Royal's 100 and an in-game year. The gameplay is hack and slash action instead of a turn-based RPG, and notably Eternights managed to include 1 same-sex option out of 4, something Persona has still yet to take the plunge on. Aside from this woke and political comparison, it got called cheap and a knockoff, which is just a bit unfair since it's made by a significantly smaller team with a significantly smaller budget. But in spite of these limitations, the game was a lot of fun to progress through, with the action gameplay being snappy and varied with new abilities and plenty of customization options depending on how you bond with the other characters. As a fan of Bayonetta, the dodge-based witch time action is something I naturally enjoy as well. And while I had heard that the story was a little anime tropey, it was nowhere near as bad as I expected. I could easily just be desensitized though, and by the end I was fully invested, especially since it didn't end up going in the way I expected it to. One thing which is easy to miss, and I find hilarious in some way, is how much the game encourages you to choose a love interest. Minor spoilers, but you will literally be unable to reach a good ending if you don't choose. So if you're looking to do an aromantic run, then be prepared for that. Even though the presentation lacked a lot of polish and some of the mini-games were repetitive, the whole package was charming in the way that only these lovingly made, lower budget games can be, similarly to Paradise Killer, which I played last year. I hate to bring it back to the Persona comparison, but as a fan of Persona myself, I would recommend it to fans of the series who want something similar but refreshing. It does take clear inspiration in some areas, but it also uses this inspiration to make a great new product and has a clear identity outside of its inspiration. Also, there was a Brave Girls cameo for like a frame, so immediate points for that as well. Brave Girls. After skipping 3 houses, I'd checked out from Fire Emblem a little bit, and when Engage was first announced, I really just glossed over it and watched the rest of the direct unfazed. But then it got closer and closer to when it was releasing, and I looked into it a bit more. I was put off at the announcement since it looked like it would just be an anniversary or celebration game, which is fine, but it wasn't what I was looking for. But when I saw that it was actually its own thing, even if it was referencing the overall franchise, and it had a new look which I really liked a lot. The colours of the characters and their clothes were just a lot more saturated and full of life compared to the past couple of entries, and the whole thing just looked like it was working within the Switch's capabilities instead of against it like the footage I've seen of Free Houses. But I'm not just going to rag on Free Houses since I want to give it a chance, and that's because Engage just really reinvigorated my appreciation for the Fire Emblem franchise. While it does have some unique mechanics from other Fire Emblem games, at its core, Engage is just a really smooth and polished Fire Emblem game. It's in a weird position, not fully resembling classic or modern Fire Emblem, lending elements from both, and while I understand that can be alienating to fans of either extreme, to me this appealed as a fresh re-entry point. I grew attached to a lot of the characters, and the support conversations were bursting with charm, and the sections in between battles didn't last too long either, giving me good chances to interact and learn more about the characters, but not devouring too much of my time and destroying the pacing. After Engage, it'll be really interesting to see what direction Nintendo and Intelligent go with Fire Emblem, since they can really try anything. Whatever it is, this time I'll be a lot more tuned in. And if you want to see me talk about Engage more, I've got a much longer video just about it. It is worth reinstating how much of a Zelda fan I am, since if you saw how much lower I put Tears of the Kingdom, it would be understandable why you might doubt that. But what truly ashamed me is how long it took me to finally get the Switch remake of Link's Awakening. I played the original about halfway through on 3DS about a decade ago, but the art style they chose for this is just so sweet and looks so good that I wanted this to be my chance to finally complete it. And that's exactly what I did. The map was just so stunning to work through, and I honestly don't think there's any other Zelda game that looks so consistently good. Like, there are some parts of other Zelda games that look good, but every part of this remake is so polished. That's the strength of these classic 2D Zelda games, is that they are scaled perfectly for an admittedly more rigid but well-paced and wholly engaging adventure that doesn't take months to complete. I don't hate long games, some of my best friends are long games, but what I love is when a game can justify its length, whether that's 2 hours, 20 or 200, and the 5 to 10 hours spent exploring Koholint Island, chatting with every NPC and gradually growing stronger as you work through each of the expertly designed dungeons is well worth it. And that's amazing considering this game is a faithful remake to a game which is now 30 years old. And while it's faithful, it's been tweaked in all the right areas. I critiqued Crisis Core Reunion for updating a lot of aspects which made it look and play modern, but there were some unpolished moments where the rushed development cycle showed, and that just isn't the case here. And this was likely an easier project, and I can never know all the details of a development cycle, but I just didn't notice any cracks here, and that's just so impressive to see. There are so many classic Zelda games that could use this kind of love, and even though it's now been almost 5 years since this remake got made, I hope the trend is continued now that Tears of the Kingdom has come out and we have time in the Zelda schedule to fill before the next mainline game. On the other hand, a new mainline 2D Zelda game would be amazing as well, especially coming off the back of A Link Between Worlds and this remake. Before playing it, Super Hot was just not the kind of game I would have ever spent my money on, and the only reason I played it was because it was short and free with my imminently ending PS Plus subscription. But I'm so happy I did take the plunge, because playing this game is so much better than watching. I'd seen a couple of friends play it before its full release and never really got the appeal. Don't be fooled, this game looks like a shooter, but in truth it's an environmental puzzle game, which is nothing like you've ever tried. If you don't know, the world and enemies and bullets and anything else only move if you do, and you have to survive and take everything else down. It's split into choreographed levels which you have to learn so you can get through unscathed, and while it's subtle, a story is being told between the lines. The narrative is sometimes more obvious with brief chat logs between chunks of levels, but otherwise you'll have to fill in the blanks by seeing what is happening, and you'll have plenty of time to do so with how often you'll be repeating the more challenging levels. Even if you don't like shooters, and even if you think it doesn't look that appealing, I would recommend trying it if you have a chance, since there isn't really anything else like it. Almost in an antithesis to Super Hot, the first time I saw Cuphead in motion I knew it was the kind of thing I wanted to play, so when I snagged it bundled with the DLC in a sale, I was happy I would get the chance, and luckily for me, it didn't disappoint. I was wary of the difficulty and was worried that repeating levels would get frustrating and it would make it hard to play. And while I did get those moments of frustration, the serotonin rush of finally beating a tough boss made it all worth it. What makes Cuphead so fun to play is witnessing how much creativity, love and inspiration went into it, and it all reads when you're playing it. While I know it's a critique some people had, I like the variety of the 3 level types: standard boss, flying boss and platforming. The bosses were more memorable than the platforming, but the variety breaking up the monotony of some bosses was a good idea. It's tough, but it was so worth it, and just a really strong overall package. I'm looking forward to going back and playing the DLC at some point, but I need to wait until I hate myself enough to put myself through such a challenge again. As a self-proclaimed rhythm game aficionado, I was intrigued hearing Thumper being described as an immersive horror rhythm game, but yeah, that's kind of what it was. It's not a rhythm game in the sense that you get certain catchy tracks to tap along to, but closer to a rhythmic obstacle course with cosmic horrors at the end you'll need to fight back against with timed attacks. While I was never scared in the same way you would be in a more traditional horror game, too much information maybe, but I've never had my hands sweat more than I have in the more intense sequences of this game. It feels like a psychedelic roller coaster you're in control of, and if you lose control, you die. And for the people able to play this in VR without immediately vomiting, I commend you. The same team announced a follow-up at the Game Awards called Thrasher, so I'm excited to see where that goes, even if from what I've seen it doesn't have the same snappy appeal Thumper does. But I'll wait until I see more and keep an open mind since Thumper exceeded all expectations. When it comes to games which I had the lowest expectations for that ended up proving me wrong, there's Slay the Spire. From footage and reviews and just the concept of the game, I was incredibly wary. It just didn't seem like the kind of thing I would like. The concept of deck building games never seemed like the kind of thing I would enjoy, and combined with roguelites, a genre I'm very particular about, I was honestly expecting the worst. But it was another piece of my extensive PS Plus backlog, so I had to at least try it. I'll do a run or two and then leave it. Cut to 30-ish hours later and I was converted to say the least. For a roguelite with quite long runs, I'd never been so obsessed for just another run, leading to many late nights getting closer and closer. It avoids a repetition that is standard for more structured roguelites, with 4 completely unique characters to choose from. In Endless Dungeon, I mentioned characters all feeling quite samey aside from heavy or light guns, but each of these characters in Slay the Spire feels so different, with wholly unique decks and gimmicks that make a run with each feel nothing like the other. Just trying different strategies and tackling the Spire from a different angle had so much mileage, and I managed to reach credits with each of the characters multiple times, favouring the Defect and the Watcher, but getting that true final ending has still evaded me. I appreciate in some sense having such a hard final goal, but attempting to reach it is why I did eventually shelf Slay the Spire to return to eventually. Its main flaw is the uncontrollable randomness. In other roguelites you have some control over prepping for your run, being able to choose a weapon in Hades, or even choosing the start area in Endless Dungeon. But in Slay the Spire, the quality of your deck relies heavily on luck, and the same goes for relics, which are usually passive buff items you acquire after beating certain challenges. For a game that relies so heavily on your choices, the longer you play it and the harder the goal becomes, the more you realise how much is out of your hands. It was alright when the goal was a little more achievable, but when you're striving for something so much harder with a final ending, the randomness just becomes a bit grating, and the formulaic nature of the Spire doesn't help either. In spite of these flaws, I still had a great time with Slay the Spire, and my obsession lies deep enough that I will return to try for that true final ending, but after a break. Out of all the PS Plus games I played this year, this is also the only one I bought permanently, mainly because I found the physical copy cheap, but still I think that counts for something. And the final PS Plus backlog game of the year, and one again which I didn't expect to love as much as I did, is Toem. It's a very unassuming game with a simple presentation style, a simple core gameplay loop, and a simple premise of earning your bus ticket by completing photography challenges in each location to finally make your way to your goal. But this simplicity all comes together and just works so well. The look of the game, while incredibly minimal, is perfect for creating explorable set pieces with hidden details and secrets to find, and even though it's all monochrome, the atmosphere is set up so well with different details and perfect shading and sound design. I usually don't use in-game cameras much outside of multiplayer games, so I didn't think a photography-focused game would be that fun, but the challenges you're given in Toem are just so enjoyable, and require engaging with the well-written characters that litter each setting. And these missions aren't all that easy either, making some of them incredibly satisfying to complete. but what made Tome work so well is how it was paced. I've mentioned in a few other shorter games that I played this year, but progression is so important to how fun it feels to work through a game. In the Pathless, I lost patience so quickly because the game was asking me to do too many different things before allowing me to continue. But in Tome, the requirements are kept lower, but because of this, going overboard and doing as much as I wanted to felt great, and even though I didn't need to, I just kept playing because the settings were so fun to explore, and I genuinely wanted to help the people I found. Because I wasn't that worried about the quota I needed to hit to proceed, it never felt like a chore and I was just having a great time. Tome was an amazing experience, and this was made even better with how clear it was the game respected my time. Sometimes it feels like game developers want you to spend more time in their world because they work so hard on it and you better appreciate every little detail they put in, and this is understandable to an extent. But when a game like Tome comes along and reminds you that games are fun and you're not being held hostage playing them, that I remember why I go out of my way for games like this. I tried playing Earthbound a few years ago on the SNES Mini plug and play and got about an hour in, but then unfortunately never went back to it. But this year I fully committed to it, and it was a perfect game to break in my analog pocket. Even though this iconic RPG was originally a home console exclusive, playing it portably suited so well and made getting through the extensive adventure simple and a lot of fun. Earthbound is perhaps one of the most impactful RPGs of its era, and there are still games being inspired by it, and it's so easy to understand why when you play it. I've described games as charming so often throughout this list, and I will continue to do so, but Earthbound really is the pinnacle, with the game's writing being so well done and each corner of the world bursting with personality. The localization was so well done, with character dialogue often being hilarious. But it does worry me that Mother 3's fan translation might not live up to the standards set, but I have high hopes. One issue I can really have with adventure RPGs is towns and cities lacking in personality and actual features, and essentially just being a new shop to buy better weapons and an inn. But this was never the case in Earthbound. I still vividly remember a lot of the different areas, and it's why after finishing the game I immediately sought out, found and bought this guidebook which goes more in depth on the world and features original art and maps. The progression was fast paced and the story was fun to uncover while never taking itself too seriously. My main issues are quite minor. I wish the main cast got to interact more on screen, and a lot of them didn't get much dialogue at all after joining the party. In all its retro glory, the game sometimes had some arbitrary requirements for progression. With a guide, these were no problem, but I can imagine it would have been more frustrating if I didn't have this resource. But none of this is game breaking, and it didn't inhibit the amazing experience I had too much. I think it's a testament to this game's quality that it stands above 60 other games that I played this year, all of which are newer than it, and it still felt great to play. I'm happy that its legacy lives on in spite of Nintendo's best efforts, and I hope that it'll at least get some more love from them in the next console generation. For whatever reason, I've avoided Souls-like games, mainly because I didn't want to spend my time getting frustrated, even if the games did look interesting and I felt like I was missing out on something. But after beating Cuphead, I was feeling a bit more confident, and with Lies of P releasing soon after, I was ready to finally try it out. And I was not disappointed. Lies of P has such a strong sense of style and atmosphere, and the parry-based combat system was tough, but was so fun to master and get better at. Like, yeah, it was difficult, but I don't think I've had such a strong sense of satisfaction beating a tough area or one of the harder bosses. I'm aware that I probably sound like every other person who enjoyed their first Souls-like game, but it's a great feeling getting into a new genre, and Lies of P was such a polished product and an amazing achievement for a smaller and newer development team. It isn't a perfect game, but like a lot of the games this high up, the problems aren't that major. It's a good starting point for people looking to try out a Souls-like game, since even though it's just as hard as the others, from what I've heard at least, the story is a lot more accessible, not requiring as much extended reading and lore research. A grungy reimagining of Pinocchio could have easily been corny, but it was done pretty well, and the inspiration made the world feel even more unique. I'm happy this game has gotten the community appreciation it deserves, and personally I think it could have taken one of the spots of a couple of those Game of the Year nominees. But it's got DLC on the way, and the sequel teased could be even better, so that's something to look forward to as well. But honestly, I'm just happy Lies of P has opened me up to trying other Souls-likes, and I'm sure this time next year I'll hopefully have tried even more. As soon as I first saw footage of Jusant, I had a gut feeling it'd be the kind of thing I'd enjoy. I'm not exactly a big climbing fan, in games or real life, and minimalist indie games like this tend to be very hit or miss, but there was just something about it. And luckily I was right. I picked it up on release day and over the next few days had an amazing time working through its perfectly designed journey up the Gargantuan mountain until I reached the final goal after 5 or so hours. The game is split into well-paced chapters, each having a distinct but cohesive feel, and the game's aesthetic shifts often enough that the simple style never wears thin, and you're instead always excited for what you're going to see next. You could easily assume that a game about climbing could quickly get boring, but the way you control the core gameplay mechanic keeps it fun, thoughtful, and engaging throughout the entire run. It's less about the actions you learn to do, and more about the natural feeling puzzle built into the environment. The map itself was also the perfect level of linearity for a game on this scale. I felt like I was pretty thorough, but there were still some secrets which I missed, and while there is always a path to follow onwards, you're regularly treated to areas where you can explore and find hidden details. And I've bitched about some games not being able to pull off minimalist storytelling well earlier on the list, but Jusant just gets it right, with cinematic moments giving you the feeling of what's going on, combined with notes and letters that you can find which fill you in on the specifics without breaking immersion, instead making the world feel more real and lived in. I've never been too interested in story-centric games like Life is Strange, but after finding out that they're developed by the same studio as Jusant, I'm now a lot more willing to try them out. A game I will defend until my dying breath is Final Fantasy XV, and while I know it has its fans, I think it has just as many people who feel the opposite. It was a weird introduction to Final Fantasy, since I was aware going in it was a departure from anything else the series had tried before, gameplay wise at least. So when I saw that Final Fantasy XVI was going to be another departure from series tradition, but also a far cry from what 15 went for as well, I was skeptical but still excited. It wasn't perfect, but Final Fantasy XVI was one of the most engrossing adventures and narratives I've experienced in gaming, and that can be attributed to the effort they put into accessible storytelling. In big, lore-heavy gaming stories, it can be easy to get lost. You could be trying hard, but once you miss a definition of one new word or zone out for 10 seconds in the wrong cutscene, then all of a sudden by the end of the game you're completely lost and don't really have a clue what's going on. 16 acknowledges how common this is and puts in multiple features that make the narrative easier to follow without dumbing itself down, and it's not just walls of text you find in an obscure menu. On top of the character relationship timeline, there's a visualized international relationship timeline and an evolving library of definitions and lore that ties into cutscenes, so whenever you pause a cutscene, relevant information is accessible to read so you can catch yourself up. All of this combined to make a story which I could stay fully engaged with and wanted to keep going so I could find out what was going to happen next. Usually a story that takes itself as seriously as 16 does would alienate me, especially compared to 15, which made sure to sprinkle in light-hearted moments more often, but because it's committed to the narrative, it worked. It also helped that Dion's narrative was being told as a relatively consistent subplot for the last 2/3 of the game, and that was likely the best part of the story, at least in my opinion, but that deserves its own video. Aside from the story, the gameplay was great as well. The abilities being tied to each summon worked well to add variety which was continuous throughout the game's runtime, an impressive feat for such a long game. While I never got as good at the combat as I've seen some people when it comes to wrecking up combos, I enjoyed the character building RPG mechanics mixed with genuinely good and amazing looking action, even if it wasn't that customizable. Out of all the games in the top 10, Final Fantasy XVI is definitely the one which I have the most complaints about, but I don't want to focus on them too much because the overall experience was so good. The more I talk about 16, the more I realise that I haven't touched, so I'll leave it for now without harping too much on the negatives. I'm looking forward to diving into the world again once both parts of the DLC are out, so I have plenty more content to get through, but even as it was at launch, Final Fantasy XVI was an adventure I don't regret having, even if I still prefer 15. For years, it felt like a pipe dream to hope for an inventive new 2D Mario game. For literally my whole gaming life, 2D Mario has been stagnant. I grew up with New Super Mario Bros. On DS, then played some of the Wii one with family and friends, completely skipped 2, and while I played U on Wii U and Switch, it was just more something to do with other people than a game I actively enjoyed. Since 2D Mario had been the same for my whole life, I just assumed it would be for the rest of it. I knew that older Mario games had switched it up more often, but I hadn't seen it, so I had no reason to assume it would happen, especially since New Super Mario games were printing money for Nintendo. But halfway through this year, what I had assumed was impossible was announced with a trailer for Super Mario Wonder, which immediately captured what I'd hoped for. it still retained all the best parts of 2D Mario, but had built itself from the ground up with new animations, new characters, new settings, new level types, new movement, new enemies, new mechanics, new everything. It solidified just how little new there was about the new Super Mario era, and for the first time I was actually excited for a 2D Mario game. I could tell gutturally that I wouldn't be disappointed, and I'm so happy I was right. You can tell that this game was made without any crunch time, with how polished every level plays and how nothing feels like filler or an obligation inclusion. And then the Wanderflower mechanic meant that every level was guaranteed to include a twist that you likely aren't going to see coming, and it somehow never got old. And with how good the game looked, I never really wanted to not be playing it before I reached credits. By the time I had finished, there were a couple small things I would have switched, like saving some of the levels for a proper post-game world. Since the special world was accessible the whole time, it didn't feel like an actual post-game, and maybe a better variety of bosses, but overall it was such a step in the right direction, and I'm now actually invested in 2D Mario and can't wait to see where it goes from here. None of you, no one can ever say I won't admit when I was wrong, because I was so wrong about Bayonetta Origins, Cereza and the Lost Demon. For those who don't know, in my last Bayonetta video, made a couple of months before this launched, I complained that I didn't really know who this game was being made for, and that it was being sold full price. And while I still stand by a couple of my points, when I eventually got round to playing it, the quality of the game overpowered any potential criticism I had. I still think that the game will not be for every Bayonetta fan, since it's very different from the original trilogy, but as its own thing that exists in the same universe and isn't trying to be something that it isn't, it excels. One aspect that really carried over from Bayonetta 1 especially is its charm. In the original Bayonetta, this manifests in fourth wall breaking, Bayonetta's quips and risque humour, but here the charm manifests in the quality of its designs, attention to detail, and the story being told. There is a lot of footage of me on this channel talking about Bayonetta 3, and in that time I barely acknowledged Cheshire, so a game diving into the origins of his relationship with Cereza was hardly an appealing premise to me. But by the end, I actually cared about this character and his relationship with Cereza, and I thought Cereza's voice acting was going to be great in going in, but the voice actress did an amazing job, and I hope she was properly compensated for her work. Games which thrive in presentation and storytelling can often miss out when it comes to having engaging gameplay, but the hybrid of exploration, puzzle solving, unconventional combat and Metroidvania-light progression all complemented each other so well and made for a fun 10 to 15 hour long campaign. The combat especially actually reminded me a little bit of Astral Chain, which makes sense since they're from the same studio, and while it was a lot more simple, it never lets you check out. And some of the enemy designs in this game were amazing, with a lot of the bosses being highlights. It's now been a little over a year since playing Bayonetta 3, and I really struggle to remember any of the bosses, when I can still remember enemy encounters from 1 and 2, so I'm happy to see that the sequel returns to series standard. I also really can't emphasize enough how distinct and amazing this game looks. I can't think of anything else to compare it to, and this inspired look really helps the game in every other aspect. I usually don't like feeling lost in games, but the way the forest feels, thanks to the atmospheric soundtrack and the design of areas, meant that instead of getting frustrated at getting lost, it just emulated a sense of childlike confusion, like literally being lost in a forest. There is still so much I have to say about Cereza and the Lost Demon, especially in terms of its place in the Bayonetta series, but I'm saving that for its own video. I've never been more happy to be proven wrong, and I can't wait to see where Bayonetta goes next. I've always been hesitant to play horror games since I've always disliked horror movies and assumed that my feelings for the genre would transcend the medium, but when I saw Resident Evil 4 was getting a remake, a game which I've always passively been interested in and have heard is a classic, I couldn't help but make my first true attempt at a horror game. Luckily for me, Resident Evil 4 is a great place to start. From what I'd seen of other horror games, I was worried that Resident Evil 4 would feel too scripted and lack much interactive gameplay, but that wasn't the case. The gunplay was responsive, and the way this combined with simple survival mechanics worked really well, and while the story and progression was linear, that wasn't an issue since the story was engaging and the environments were all detailed and looked amazing. I also didn't expect to enjoy the cast of characters so much in a game like this, but Ada, Ashley, Louis, and of course Leon are all characterized so well, and I was invested in what would happen to them. This is also what led me and the friends I played with to return to the other remakes, and while I didn't enjoy 2 or 3 as much, I'm still happy that they had a lot of what made 4 so enjoyable. I mentioned both in the previous part, and 2 would definitely have been in the top 20 if it weren't for how it handled the double playthrough. Playing it in a group of 3 also felt ideal for the level of challenge we experienced, meaning we could all stay involved and engaged while not getting fatigued by constantly playing such an overbearing game for long stretches. For me, it was the ideal way to play, and while I'm tempted to replay solo at some point, this worked really well for us. This did mean that we were playing it on console, which was great, but my only regret is not playing on PC. I missed out on Tramp Stamp Leon, and I think that's a real horror here. I never really knew that much about Death Stranding, except that some people thought it was just an overrated walking sim, and also Norman Reedus is carrying a baby in an orange thing. But in a moment of curiosity, I actually looked up what this was about in more detail, and once I heard it was a post-apocalyptic delivery simulator, my interest was piqued. So I picked up the director's cut and gave it a go. I didn't consciously become obsessed with Death Stranding, but all of a sudden I just couldn't really stop playing. The story was just the right kind of weird for me, and the presentation was stunning, with a mix of detailed nature, sci-fi tech, and inky, indescribable horror gave it a unique visual identity. But what really got me was the gameplay. I can't even really disagree and say that this isn't a walking simulator, because you will be doing a lot of walking. But over time, you'll unlock more options to make the gradually more treacherous routes more manageable, and the way you interact with the world becomes a slow strategic puzzle that every player will tackle differently. Every detail of the map felt intentionally designed, and I never got tired of exploring new areas, and even after spending hours in the game and finishing it, I still know that there are some areas I haven't got to. It's a game with a lot more depth than I think people give it credit for, and while it won't be for everyone, you'll have engaging experiences playing it that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Everything intertwined so well to make an experience I still remember fondly. The story also could have easily been super dour and depressing, and while it did feel like that sometimes, small moments of levity peeked through to let you know that while this game does take itself seriously, it can still have its goofy, self-aware moments. I'm hesitantly excited for the sequel. While I would be happy to play something similar, I'm almost expecting it to be something completely different. But even if the Death Stranding universe was left at just one game, it wouldn't change how much fun I had playing it. While it just misses out on topping this list, my favourite game which released this year is Hi-Fi Rush. When this game launched out of nowhere near the start of the year, I was initially disappointed to see that it was a console exclusive for Xbox, since a rhythm action game with this kind of art style is almost tailor-made for me. But when I saw it was on PC as well, I didn't hesitate for a moment to start playing. As soon as you start and get to grip with the controls, everything immediately clicks and you know you'll be in for a fun ride. And that is what I appreciate. This game is so committed to being fun throughout its entire run. The bright, saturated 2000s cartoonesque look of the games makes you feel like you're playing an episode of Totally Spies or Martin Mystery, and while the action gameplay never gets too complex, the way your skill relies on your rhythm makes it a unique experience to master. And the narrative is nothing original, but it is told so well, with such lovable characters that you can't help but get invested. While it was rumoured that this game underperformed, this has been set straight by Microsoft calling it a breakout hit. So I really hope they choose to continue the momentum, since Hi-Fi Rush could easily spawn its own series, and I would happily play every game on launch day. Everything about it just works so well, so it just feels like it would be a waste if this was a one-off flash in the pan. I've been saying a lot throughout this list that I've been surprised at how much I've enjoyed certain games, but I think I always knew that I would love Tunic. Even then, it still surprised me with just how much of a great time I had with it. When I learned about the in-game mechanic of unlocking pages of an instruction manual to learn more about the world, the controls, and the story, I thought it was genius. But I also knew that when I inevitably liked the game, I would want a physical copy of the manual, so I waited until that physical copy, which as I predicted, not that it was really hard to guess, came with a manual, and I pre-ordered it. Before I gush about the game itself, I want to quickly commend Fangamer for how well they did with the physical release, since for a standard edition it came with so many cool extras as well as a manual, and it all looks amazing. Aside from this, the game itself was just so well done. A consistent source of praise I've given the games I've liked this year is how cohesive they feel, and that is epitomised in Tunic. While it could have easily become preoccupied with patting itself on the back for how clever the in-game manual idea was, it still would have been a good game which stood on its own without it. Tunic has often been reduced to a 2D Zelda clone since it was cited as an inspiration, but that really does it a disservice. The exploration and puzzle solving feels so rewarding since no other game rewards you for paying as much attention as Tunic does. And every time I tried something which I thought I was imagining and it ended up working, I was ecstatic. The story was minimalist in the best way possible, and the way the narrative progresses and ends ensures that you've been on an emotional journey the game has subtly been guiding you down all along. And it was all presented so well. The world itself has an intentionally slightly unpolished look that could easily look bad with a more incompetent design team, but it's stylized so well to feel immersive, and that's combined with a captivating artwork you get sprinkled throughout the manual, which brings the game's setting to life. And add on to that the vaporwave-esque relaxing soundtrack which complements it all so well. Everything here just works. Because Tunic doesn't hold your hand, I don't think everyone will love it, but I think those who do get past any initial confusion will have a great time. The game was a 7-year-long passion project, and I love when games developed like this turn out so good, and you can really tell that it was a labour of love. I'm begging for someone to hit me on the head with a brick at just the right angle so I can play Tunic again for the first time, but until then I can at least reminisce. So that was my top 70 games of the year, and while that was most of what I played, it wasn't all of it. Now I'm done with the main ranking, I'm going to go over the games that I've started and are still playing, the games I didn't get far enough into to justify including on the ranking, and a couple live service games and games I replayed this year. Then after that, a bit of a retrospective before finally finishing. The game I'm most actively still playing is Triforce Heroes. It's been ongoing since late spring, and if you know anything about it, you probably know why it's taking so long. It heavily encourages multiplayer, so I've been playing it slowly but surely with friends. Annie, who helps me with editing scripts, and Botanautical, my thumbnail artist and editor. But because of this, we can only play it when we're all together, and when we're all in the mood for it. It started off really strong, but the levels are getting progressively harder, and since the game has a pretty tough life system that leads to a lot of wasted time if you get a game over, the game can occasionally be demoralizing. And this is made worse considering the shared health bar, strong focus on co-op, and precision needed to get through every level. It's still a fun game, and beating difficult stages is incredibly satisfying, but thanks to the game over system, it can just be a tricky one to want to play casually the further we get through. Sticking with Zelda, I also started replaying Twilight Princess, but not really since I've never finished it. It feels more like a re-attempt than a replay. Ironically, I've left it at almost the exact same point I left it a decade ago when I last played it, being around halfway after Arbiter's Grounds. I don't know what it is about this point in particular, but I just found it tricky to find time to boot up my Wii U and keep playing the pretty slow-paced adventure. I was also playing it around the time when I was playing Witcher 3, and I wanted to dedicate more time to that, thinking I would like it more if I did so I think I naturally stopped working through it as quickly. Both of these I can see myself going back to next year, so hopefully they'll have a proper entry then. I'm also very slowly working my way through the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV on mobile. I've had some really fun moments playing this in free moments in cafes or while travelling, but soon after beating Kalamazoo, I checked ahead in a guide and saw the next section in the game is awkward, and it kind of killed my motivation to pick it up. Like, it was a fun distraction, but if it needed more active attention, I could see myself getting frustrated, so I think I need to dedicate some time before getting past the next section of the game. Who knows when that'll be, but hopefully I can put in the effort. I also started playing Ooblets and King of Fighters 14, but just didn't dedicate enough time to each to really get into, and got distracted by other games. I wouldn't say that I dropped them since I barely started, but I got just deep enough that I think they deserve a mention. And finally, for the still kind of playing section, there are a couple party games which I started but have barely put enough time into to make a proper judgment, being Rumbo and Moving Out. Both seem like they could be fun, but again, I haven't really put the time in with either. Now for the games which I dropped and don't really see myself going back to, but didn't play for long enough to include them in the list. Ironically, almost all of these are PS Plus games, so since I didn't directly pay for them, that made me a lot more willing to let them go. But that's also why I tried them out, since I wanted to get my money's worth from the subscription. I'm happy I made the effort since I played games like Toem, Slay the Spire, and Superhot, but what did I not like as much? These can be split into 3 categories pretty easily. First are the racing games with Team Sonic Racing, Hot Wheels Unleashed, and Need for Speed Heat, all from PS Plus. And I just didn't enjoy how any of them handled, and they just weren't that fun to play. I'm sure maybe if I dedicated a bit more time to each, I could have had a slightly better time, but none of them enticed me to put in that effort. I was particularly disappointed by Team Sonic Racing since I remember loving Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing when I was younger, and just felt that was more inspired and energetic compared to Sonic Racing, which just felt very plain in comparison. Then the fighting games. I got Virtua Fighter 5 with PS Plus, and the only 2 games in the section that I actually bought were Guilty Gear Xrd Rev 2 and King of Fighters 2000. Virtua Fighter felt a little too simple, Guilty Gear went too ham on the tutorials, annoying me more than teaching me, and King of Fighters probably needed the original manual because it was the opposite of Guilty Gear, giving you absolutely no guidance. I want to go back to a newer Guilty Gear since I love the character designs and Strive in particular looks good, and as I briefly mentioned, I dipped my foot in King of Fighters 14, and I'm willing to give the series a couple more chances since I love Benimaru's design so much. Then the miscellaneous games being Biomutant and Tales of Iron, both from PS Plus as well. I didn't hate Tales of Iron, but it just didn't have that much depth, and even though the presentation was a cute idea, it wasn't enough for me to be invested for 8 more hours. I pretty actively disliked Biomutant though, everything just felt off and I really couldn't get far. When I talk about loving some games for being cohesive, this is the opposite. Nothing seemed to fit together and the short time I tried it was just very unsatisfying. But that's all I dropped, and compared to what I played and finished, it really doesn't seem like much. But on the note of dropping, let's have a quick look at the live service games I played this year. One thing I really didn't expect to be saying a year ago is that I've been on an indefinite hiatus from Genshin Impact since spring. I still think the game has a really strong foundation, the exploration is fun, the world mostly looks great, and the core gameplay is unique and engaging, but everything is made so much worse with the gacha. Every good aspect of Genshin is made worse by the game's need to make an exorbitant profit. Quests are drawn out, dialogue is too wordy, and progression becomes grindy. Fun event mechanics are made temporary to give you FOMO if you take a break from the game. Everything is tweaked to force you to spend as much time playing as possible. After a while it starts to feel like a chore, and a game which should be a fun open world adventure begins to feel like more effort than it's worth. Even when fun new areas dropped, or new events, or new characters, I eventually started to feel cynical and over all of it. It's a shame as well, since I was hyped for Fontaine essentially since I started playing in 2020, but by the time I'd pulled Baishu, I was ready to leave it indefinitely. Ideally, I'd come back when the game is finished, since I know that after a while I'll start to miss it, and I'm still semi-invested in the narrative, but for now I don't regret dropping it at all. I played so many more games than last year, likely because I spent less time playing Genshin, and with how many games I loved way more than any of my recent time in Genshin, I think that was the right decision. On a lighter note, I've continued playing Fortnite socially just like last year. 2023 was mostly Chapter 4, which is a pretty meh chapter, which is a shame since the Season 1 map was pretty strong, but the changes made after Season 2 really just crapped it up and it was super incohesive and awkward to play on. But the core gameplay was still fun, so I can't complain. The short-lived OG season was a nice change of pace though, and I really appreciated it being only a month since by the end I was really missing modern Fortnite, but it was a cool throwback. Chapter 5 has started strong though. The map is looking good so far, and I really hope they don't screw with it too much like they did in 4. They also added a train, which I know is weirdly specific, but it's something I've wanted since Chapter 2, so I'm happy it's finally a feature, and I really hope they keep adding to it instead of getting rid of it anytime soon. But yeah, Fortnite is still a lot of fun with friends, and I'm likely going to have it here next year as well. I really focused on trying new games this year, especially in the latter half, but around halfway through I had a couple pangs of nostalgia and had to replay some old favourites. I briefly mentioned it in the ranking, but I replayed Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky after picking it up on the Wii U eShop right before it closed down. I've played this game so much and I'm still a big fan even now. It's still got a great story, and this time I was hoping to get deeper into the hefty post-credits content, but I ended up leaving my Piplup and Riolu not long after getting to the credits, so that's ironic. Hopefully I'll pick it back up at some point since I love the beautiful pixel art and charming characters, but I'm not going to rush to return. I also started replaying Subspace Emissary, which is a story mode from Smash Bros. Brawl, but playing multiplayer with Jay, both using crusty sideways Wii remotes, and the game clearly not being designed with 2 players in mind, really stopped any motivation for us to continue. I still have a lot of nostalgia for this story mode, but if I try it again, I'll try single player with a better controller. Finally, I also replayed what might be my favourite game of all time, Kid Icarus Uprising. As you can imagine, I have so much to say about this game, and if you watched my short Fire Emblem video, you might have noticed that I mentioned in the outro that I have a video planned on it, and while that got a little delayed, it's still very much in the works, so I'll save my thoughts for that. But if you love Kid Icarus, or you're just interested in it, keep your eyes open for that. So, now that's everything I actually played last year, but what do I want to play in 2024? I have an embarrassingly long backlog, but just a few which I'm hoping to play next year include Fire Emblem Echoes, Prey, Star Fox Zero, Wargroove, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Nier Replicant, Deadpool, Fantasy Life, Shin Megami Tensei 5, Dragon Quest IX, Slime Rancher, The Messenger, No More Heroes, Star Ocean Second Story R, Xenoblade X, Sifu, Unravel, Wonderful 101, The Witness, Death's Door, Epistory, Elden Ring, Neo The World Ends With You, Psychonauts, The Beginner's Guide, Amori, Tearaway, Neon White Transistor, Drill Dozer, One Piece Odyssey, Welcome to Volcano High, Crystals, Ghost Runner, A Plague Tale, Chia, Street Fighter 6, Sunset Overdrive, Bramble the Mountain King, and I'm sure even more which I haven't included. If you have any thoughts, positive or negative, let me know in the comments, since I'm looking forward to hopefully talking about some of these next year. I'm also hoping to play the second Professor Layton game, Wheel of Katamari Reroll, and the second half of Great Ace Attorney, following on from the entries which I played this year. I've also bought the physical release of Baldur's Gate 3, and since that was Game of the Year this year, I obviously have high hopes, but I'll try not to let that impact my opinion of it too much. Also, if you watched my 2022 ranking, you might remember I got halfway through Horizon Forbidden West, but my save got corrupted, so I had to drop it. Or at least that's what I thought. Turns out it must have been an issue with my disc since I tried loading it up with a friend's copy and I recovered it, so maybe I'll continue that next year as well. When it comes to upcoming releases I'm hyped for, there's nothing really too much aside from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I'm hoping I'll love since the first part of the remake was my favourite game last year, but that's a very high bar, and also Rosh isn't in the trailer, but I hope he at least makes a cameo. Also, Persona 3 Reload, which I don't know if I'll play at launch, as you saw I have a massive backlog, but maybe I'll get swept up in the hype. Other than that, since it's highly likely that Nintendo's next console will launch around autumn, I hope that it'll have a strong launch lineup, but that's a bit far off to predict at this point. My aforementioned friend Annie is great at making graphs and working with stats, so as a little bonus she put together some graphs which are great at visualizing my taste this year to a degree. Last year I was pretty embarrassed that the oldest game I played was from 2013, so even though I still skew quite modern, I'm happy that I've gone so much further back and tried a bigger variety of games. But when looking at how much I like the games based on when they launched, it's pretty obvious that I liked mostly newer games. Of course, Earthbound is a clear outlier here, but everything else in the top half of the list is from 2012 or later, whereas when we look at the bottom half, the release dates are way more varied with massive dips between brand new and relatively old. What really stuck out to me when looking at this is just how many of the top 20, the top 10 in particular, are from this year. Looking at this is why I roll my eyes so aggressively when people say gaming is dying or getting worse, because so much good came out this year alone. Yeah, there are some negative trends which can be sensationalized, but there have always been negative trends, and even in the last decade, games have gotten so much better, whether it's quality of life changes or everything just getting more polished. Of course, bad games still get released, but I think gaming is generally evolving in a positive direction, at least from my perspective. A trend which was much clearer when working through the ranking is my distaste for games that want too much of my time. Even though this looks like a pretty even spread at first glance with an even distribution of long and short throughout, any game longer than 40 hours to beat is in the bottom half. For reference, these aren't all my times, but the times from howlongtobeat.com, since the Switch in particular is pretty bad at tracking more precise hours, so this isn't how long I took, but how long it takes an average person to complete the game. But for the games I did complete, it's pretty spot on. The 4 games over 40 hours long were Rune Factory 5 at dead last, Witcher 3 at 55th, Monster Hunter World at 48th, and Tears of the Kingdom at 41st. For the first 3, I didn't get close to actually doing that many hours, because they didn't give me the drive to put the equivalent of a few sleepless days into them, but with Tears of the Kingdom, even though I only got about halfway through the story, I put in over 65 hours compared to the average 60 it takes to complete. Maybe me being so meticulous killed the game's intended pacing, but I wanted to enjoy and explore it like I did with Breath of the Wild when that launched. But maybe that was my mistake, all things I can think about when I eventually try and beat it. I definitely loved some longer games as well, with Death Stranding, Final Fantasy 16 and Lies of P being standouts, but I think each of them being perfectly paced is why I enjoyed them so consistently throughout a long runtime. And while there isn't too much to say about the games I played by console, except for a clear bias towards modern systems, I do want to tackle my hefty Steam, DS and 3DS backlog next year, so I hope that equals that out a bit too. Making fully opinion-based content like this is a bit divorced from the usual video essay-esque stuff which I usually make, and I make it purely because it's fun to look back and just be self-indulgent about what I think about something. After ranking 21 games last year, I aimed to play a considerable amount more so I could have more to talk about now, and also just try a wider variety. And while I'm happy I achieved that and got the chance to play so many great games, I don't think I'll aim to one-up 70 next year. If anything, it'll likely be less, but we'll have to see. At the time of writing this conclusion, I've played 3 games, so at this rate I'll only play a piss poor 64.5 games in 2024, but let's not rush for a quota. Last year I predicted Tears of the Kingdom and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth would be my favourites, but seeing how wrong I was with how far Tears of the Kingdom was from first, and with Rebirth getting delayed, I'm not going to make any sweeping statements about what I'll like the most. But if there's one thing I want to carry over to next year, it's to keep an open mind. 1, 2, 3! Now, if you've made it all the way to the outro, thank you. If you haven't subscribed already, then doing that would be amazing if you want to hear even more about what I have to say about games. I actually dropped hints about what I want to work on next throughout the video, but if they slip past you, soon I'm going to do a follow-up to my 2 Bayonetta videos, this time on Cereza and the Lost Demon, since I have so much more to say than what I did here. Also, something about Dion from Final Fantasy 16, but for that I'm going to wait until summer for the game to hit its first anniversary. But sometime between these 2 videos, I have a Kid Icarus Uprising project that's already half finished, and hopefully that'll be ready around spring. Again, if you have any thoughts or opinions on the games that I've mentioned or these video ideas, let me know in the comments, and well done, this is actually really the end.